One night in November of 1999, a deputy was driving along a remote mountain road in Southern California when he spotted a car pulled off to the side of the road up ahead. Now, this car's engine was still running, and the passenger side door was clearly wide open, but there didn't appear to be anyone inside the car. Now, this was a very remote road, so the deputy assumed the driver must be having some sort of car trouble, because otherwise, why would they stop here? So the deputy pulled over, hopped out of his cruiser, and began walking towards this car to see if he could help. But before the deputy reached the car, he noticed something dangling out of the passenger side door. The deputy reflexively put his hand on his holster and walked slowly the last few feet up to the car. And when he finally actually got to see inside of this car, he just froze. It looked like a set from a horror movie, except this was not fake. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the Amazon Music follow button is fast asleep, slowly pull the blankets off their feet, exposing them to attack by monsters. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of November 19th, 1999, Carolyn Stahl had an extra bright smile on her face as she saw her patients at her eye clinic in Long Beach, California. Sure, it was another busy and hectic Friday, but it was also Carolyn's 44th birthday, and her husband Ken was going to take her out to dinner the next night to celebrate. In many ways, Carolyn and Ken Stahl were a classic Orange County power couple. She was an optometrist, and he was an anesthesiologist at a nearby hospital. They lived in a condo in a gated community, and Carolyn's interior design talents had made their home the envy of all their friends. And with no children at home, Carolyn and Ken liked to spend their money on things like expensive clothes, travel, and extravagant hobbies, like Ken's antique sword collection. But even with all that wealth, Carolyn had always remained down to earth. She was sweet to her friends, and she remembered their birthdays and other special occasions with cards and gifts. She talked to her mother back in her native Michigan at least twice a week, and she was planning a trip back home for the holidays to see her. And Carolyn took special care of Ken and always made sure he had whatever he needed. Carolyn even picked out the seeds from Ken's watermelon because she knew he couldn't stand them. Carolyn remained in a great mood that day as she gave eye exams to one patient after another. And it was the first time in a while she'd felt like everything was going well in her life, because she and her 57-year-old husband, Ken, had been through a lot that year. Ken had been having heart problems, and a few months earlier, he had undergone an 8-hour operation to restore proper blood flow. The surgery had left Ken feeling weak and depleted for months in a way Carolyn had never seen before. Carolyn knew that bad hearts ran in Ken's family. His father had died from a heart attack, so she really didn't take her time with her husband for granted. And recently, Ken had finally started feeling much better, and he told Carolyn how excited he was to go out with her for her birthday. And so Carolyn was so excited. Ken planned to take them to a Mexican restaurant in the pretty town of San Juan Capistrano, and then after dinner, they'd go on a romantic stroll near the historic Spanish mission in the area, and Carolyn thought this was a perfect way to celebrate her birthday, and to celebrate a new start for the couple. The following day, Saturday, November 20th, Ken was busy getting ready for his and Carolyn's big night out, and he really wanted everything to go perfectly. If Carolyn was sweet and sociable, Ken was intense and ambitious. He always felt like he was following in his father's footsteps and not quite measuring up. Ken was the only son of a prominent anesthesiologist who had once owned a hospital and made the news all the time. By comparison, Ken had only managed to get himself appointed to an obscure medical board, and he never seemed to fly quite as high as his father. Ken was really close to his mother, but he suspected that even she thought his career was less impressive than his father's had been. Ken also had this growing sense that he was running out of time. He worked out like a maniac to stay fit, and routinely went on 25-mile hikes and day-long bike rides. He was naturally athletic and had gone to college on a football scholarship, but Ken knew he had very likely inherited his father's heart problems, and so he was unlikely to live to a ripe old age. But this really only served to make Ken more driven to succeed in the time that he had. But on that particular Saturday, as Ken got ready, he actually found himself feeling quite relaxed. And when Carolyn walked into the room he was in, wearing a pretty red dress and seemingly all the gold and diamonds she owned, Ken just stared and smiled. Ken finished getting ready, then took his wife's hand, and they walked outside together. They got into Ken's car, pulled out of their gated community, and set off on the 25-mile drive to San Juan Capistrano for their big birthday dinner date. At 10 p.m. that night, Deputy Tony Castillo of the Orange County Sheriff's Department was in his cruiser, out on his usual rounds. Deputy Castillo eased off the gas when he noticed a silver Dodge Stratus car pulled over in the breakdown lane on a rural highway outside of San Juan Capistrano. It was pitch black, and there wasn't much traffic. Castillo figured there wasn't a reason for anyone to stop right there unless they were having car trouble, so he decided he would walk over and see if they needed any help. Castillo pulled his cruiser in behind the car. He could see that the car's engine was still running and the high beam lights were on, and the passenger side door was wide open. Just ahead of the car on the side of the road, Castillo saw a pole with an emergency phone box attached to it. He thought maybe the passenger in this car had jumped out of the car after it pulled over to go use that call box to call for help, because maybe their car had broken down. But then Castillo noticed a woman's bare foot sticking out of that open passenger door, and he knew right then something had to be wrong. Castillo radioed to let dispatch know what he'd found and that he was now going to go investigate. Then Castillo got out of the cruiser, put his right hand on his holster, and began walking towards the back of the Dodge. Castillo's footsteps on the gravel were the only sound. Castillo saw what looked like a smear of blood on the back passenger side door. But he went around to the driver's side, and he saw right away the front window was smashed. And Castillo saw a scene of pure horror inside the car. A man was slumped over in the driver's seat, still wearing a seatbelt, and a woman who had been in the passenger seat was sprawled across the front seat, basically on the driver, with her head on the man's lap. Both of them had been shot multiple times, and they were drenched in blood, and when Castillo checked both of them for a pulse, he found they had none. They were both dead. Castillo rushed back to his cruiser, and he radioed dispatch to tell them that he had just walked up on two apparent homicide victims out on Ortega Highway. Then Castillo ran the plates on the Dodge Stratus, and the vehicle came back as being registered to Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And while he couldn't know for sure quite yet, Castillo was reasonably certain that those were the two victims. After getting Castillo's message, the sheriff's office assigned two veteran detectives, Joe Holmes and James McDonald, to lead the potential murder investigation. They arrived on the lonely stretch of road on Ortega Highway at about 1 a.m. The area was already alive, with crime scene technicians and sheriff's deputies gathering up evidence, photographing the victims, and just trying to make sense of the baffling scene. The deputies who were already at the scene informed Detectives Holmes and McDonald that the victims were indeed Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And based on the scene in the car, the deputies believed that Ken had been shot first and then Carolyn. Detective Holmes looked closely at the two bodies inside the car, and he thought the deputies were probably right. He thanked them for their help, and then did an initial search of the car and the surrounding area. And honestly, Holmes was kind of impressed by how little physical evidence had been left behind at the scene. There were no footprints, no fingerprints, no skid marks, no bullet casings, and no weapon. Whoever did this had been very thorough, leaving law enforcement with almost nothing to work with. But then Holmes and McDonald did an extensive examination of the bloody interior of the car, and they began to discover some clues. Carolyn was covered in expensive jewelry, and the only piece that was missing was a single earring that had fallen on the ground. Likewise, Ken had plenty of cash and credit cards in his wallet, but nothing of value had been taken, so this didn't look like a robbery. The two detectives saw that both victims had been shot multiple times from outside the car. One bullet had gone through the driver's side door, and the others through the open window. So this could not be a traditional murder-suicide either. Somebody else had fired 8 to 12 bullets into Carolyn and Ken and then left them for dead. To Holmes and McDonald, this honestly looked like a mob hit, and the shootings had a depressing familiarity to McDonald. In his years as a detective, he had investigated multiple murders on this highway, Ortega Highway. There was the farmhand who was found buried in a shallow grave, and the dead man in the trunk of an abandoned car. McDonald sometimes thought that Ortega Highway was pretty much just a place for killers to dispose of bodies. But he just couldn't begin to understand how two middle-aged, very successful doctors from a wealthy gated community could wind up slaughtered in this desolate place. Word that Carolyn and Ken had been gunned down on a rural mountain road near San Juan Capistrano immediately dominated the news. The seemingly random quality of the shooting sent a shiver across the whole region of Southern California where Carolyn and Ken lived, and it left Ken and Carolyn's family and friends almost speechless. No one could imagine somebody hating the couple so much that they needed to kill them. The owner of the eye care clinic where Carolyn practiced joked that Carolyn was so kind they deliberately gave her the grumpiest patients because she could always cheer them up. And Ken's colleagues spoke equally highly of him. A doctor who had served on a state board with Ken said that he was revered by other doctors for his wise medical judgment. And friends also pointed out that the couple worked all the time, often 6 days a week. Ken provided anesthesia for surgeries at multiple medical facilities, so he had a complex, unpredictable schedule. And Carolyn was so devoted to her practice that she had previously canceled vacation plans to avoid inconveniencing her colleagues. So their friends wondered when they would even have time to have made enemies. And early on, investigators struggled with the same question. On December 4th, so 2 weeks after the murders, hundreds of mourners crowded into St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Huntington Beach, California. They cried together, they comforted each other, and they celebrated Carolyn and Ken's lives. Ken's 87-year-old mother made her way to the front of the crowd. She said she had always braced herself for the possibility that her son might die young because of his bad heart, but nothing had prepared her for her son's violent end. Then she broke down in tears and said all she wanted to do was hold her son one more time. In the days following the funeral, Detectives McDonald and Holmes still didn't have much encouraging news for Ken and Carolyn's families, but their investigative team was still very busy. At a separate memorial service held for Ken by his colleagues, deputies had asked all the attendees to sign in a guest book. They wanted to know who was there, and they wanted to compare handwriting samples to documents they had collected from where Ken and Carolyn lived and worked to see if they could find anything connecting Ken's colleagues to the killings. But after a few weeks into the investigation, Holmes and McDonald still didn't have a suspect in mind, but they were getting a better picture of the killer. The autopsy confirmed that both Carolyn and Ken had been killed by multiple gunshots sometime between the hours of 8:30 p.m. and 10 p.m., so not long before Deputy Castillo had found the car. Also, a separate ballistics analysis found that all the gunshots came from a single gun, most likely a .357 Magnum revolver. That gave Holmes and McDonald a couple of key pieces of information. First, Ken and Carolyn were most likely murdered by a single gunman. And second, the killer was cold and collected. They had fired at least 8 shots from a revolver that held only 6 bullets, meaning the shooter had to stop in the middle of the murders, reload their weapon, and start firing again. Those reports forced Holmes and McDonald to think about the last minutes of Carolyn's life. Her husband was dead, and she was all alone in a cold, dark, strange place. Meanwhile, her killer was casually reloading their gun so they could shoot more bullets into her. I mean, this was a truly awful way to go. And that information pushed the detectives to dig even deeper into Carolyn and Ken's lives in the hope they would find something that would lead them to the killer. And in doing this deep dive, Holmes and McDonald soon discovered that Carolyn and Ken's 14-year marriage was not nearly as perfect as some of their grieving friends and relatives had thought. Some of the couple's loved ones had come forward and told the detectives that Carolyn and Ken had problems, a lot of problems. Carolyn's sister Linda actually reached out and asked to meet with the detectives. She said she didn't want to speak ill of the dead, but she really needed them to know the truth. And so, on a cool December day, Linda arrived at the sheriff's station, and she followed Holmes and McDonald into a small, comfortable office. And within a few seconds of sitting down, Linda went on an absolute tirade about her brother-in-law, Ken. She told the detectives that Ken had a history of cheating that began way before he even met Carolyn, Ken's first marriage had ended because Ken had an affair. Then Ken had married the woman he had the affair with, but that marriage also fell apart within just 3 months. Linda said her sister Carolyn was well aware of Ken's romantic history when she had moved in with him back in 1984. But Carolyn was determined to make a better man of him. And after they had been living together for a year, Carolyn gave Ken an ultimatum: marry her, or the relationship would be over. Ken had told friends he never wanted to get married again, but he reluctantly gave in to Carolyn's demand. Linda said their marriage actually seemed to go pretty smoothly for a while. Carolyn was close with Ken's mother, and she was also close with Ken's son from his first marriage, and with 2 doctors' incomes, they made a ton of money, and so their future looked quite bright. Suddenly, Linda trailed off and just stopped talking. The detectives asked her if she needed a break, or if they could get her anything, but she said she did want to keep going. She needed to get this all out. Then Linda took a deep breath and composed herself and told the detectives that things had taken a really bad turn for her sister about 5 years earlier. She said Carolyn had come home from visiting family in Michigan, and she found a woman she didn't know eating fast food on the couch in her living room. The woman was just as surprised as Carolyn, and she fled the house immediately, but Ken had admitted he was romantically involved with that woman. Linda said she had hoped her sister would just leave Ken right then and there, but she didn't. Instead of demanding a divorce, Carolyn had demanded marriage counseling. But even with marriage counseling, Ken's behavior didn't change. He had at least 3 more affairs that Linda said she was aware of, and she said his address book was still full of women's names and phone numbers. Linda clutched the arms of her chair tight, and she fought back tears while she talked about her sister. But she took a deep breath and continued her story. She told the detectives that she had been so angry at Ken that she finally confronted him about his chronic cheating and about how much he was hurting her sister. One of the detectives asked how Ken responded to that, and Linda gave a slight laugh and shook her head, and then she said Ken had just shrugged his shoulders and told her that, he was the person he was, and Carolyn just had to accept that. Finally, Linda told the detectives that Carolyn went to great lengths to hide the ugly truth about her marriage. Carolyn was always very careful to give the impression of marital bliss to friends and coworkers. She would even buy herself her own Christmas presents. She would wrap them and put tags on them that said they were from Ken, even though obviously they were not, and she would put them under the tree, and so that when friends and family came over, they would see how good Ken was being to his wife. And Ken just played along with this for the sake of appearances. Linda said one of the reasons Carolyn was buying all these gifts for herself is because she believed buying nice things for herself made her happy. She called it retail therapy. But Linda knew her sister better than anybody, and she knew no matter what Carolyn did, no matter what she bought, no matter how nice it was, nothing could change the fact that Ken had totally broken her heart. The detectives shared a look. Linda's retail therapy comment had just potentially cleared up a question they'd had for weeks. When they had searched Carolyn and Ken's home right after the murders, they found nearly $30,000 in brand new women's clothing and accessories. A lot of it was actually still wrapped in plastic, with the price tags still attached. That had really confused the detectives at the time, but now it kind of made sense. The detectives thanked Linda for all her help, and then they walked her out of the station. McDonald and Holmes hadn't let on in front of her, but Linda's revelations about Ken and Carolyn's troubled relationship opened up a world of potential murder suspects. Did a former girlfriend take revenge on Ken for leaving her? Or did a jealous husband of one of the women that Ken had an affair with lash out? There was even a chance that Ken had been the lone target of one of those jilted lovers or angry husbands, and Carolyn had just happened to be with him at the time of the murder. With this new information, the detectives now wanted to dig into all of Ken's communications with all the women he was potentially having affairs with. Like most doctors in the 1990s, Ken carried a pager, which is a small electronic device that buzzes and gives a phone number to call when somebody needs you. The detectives got Ken's pager, and they contacted every phone number on it. This at least allowed them to reconstruct key parts of Ken's last day. The detectives found a fellow anesthesiologist who paged Ken around 8 p.m. on the night of the murder. This other anesthesiologist had hoped that Ken could cover for him at a surgery the next morning. The doctor said Ken sounded normal when they talked, and that Ken was out celebrating his wife's birthday. So McDonald and Holmes reasoned that whatever happened to the couple that night probably caught them completely by surprise. McDonald also came across a Mexican immigrant named Adriana Vasco who had paged Ken on the morning of the murders. She explained that she had become friends with Ken several years earlier when she worked in the office at the National Pain Institute where he was a part-time anesthesiologist. Adriana said that Ken had agreed to get her desktop computer repaired, and she had paged him to find out how the repairs were going. MacDonald was immediately suspicious of this. He couldn't understand why a busy doctor would be volunteering to repair computers on the side. The detective asked Adriana flat out if she was having an affair with Ken, but she denied it. Adriana insisted that Ken was just a very generous guy. He had helped her out financially numerous times over the years. The call with Adriana lasted only 5 minutes, but MacDonald came away from it with the distinct sense that he had just been lied to. But he had no evidence to back up his gut feeling, so he let it drop, at least for the moment. Over the coming days, MacDonald and Holmes repeatedly asked Ken's family and friends what they knew about Adriana Vasco. The detectives got nothing but blank stares. None of the friends or family had ever heard of her. Then, in late December, a woman contacted the detectives and admitted right at the start that she'd had an affair with Ken in the mid-1990s. And when she heard about the murders, she'd recalled a conversation she'd had with Ken back then. She said Ken had complained that he was being blackmailed by someone close to him and that he was not in control of his own life. The woman's story was chilling, and blackmail was not out of the realm of possibility. After all, Ken had had multiple affairs, and most people assumed he was rich because he was a doctor. But the detectives had also discovered that Ken's health issues had caused him to miss months of work in the past. That had led to some financial strain and had forced Ken and Carolyn to move out of their $700,000 home into the comfortable but much more modest condo where they had lived at the time of their deaths. The detectives also knew Carolyn had spent at least $30,000 on clothes and jewelry for herself. So now Holmes and MacDonald wondered if the murders simply came down to money. Maybe Ken couldn't pay someone who was blackmailing him, so they killed him and his wife. But as 1999 came to an end, the detectives still had no major suspects. They had followed a bunch of different leads, but so far, nothing had paid off. However, both detectives had a strong feeling that cracking this case would begin with one of the women Ken had an affair with, and they thought that woman could be Adriana Vasco. Both detectives were confident she knew a lot more than she had told them, so it was time to have another conversation. On February 29, 2000, so over 3 months after the murders, detectives MacDonald and Holmes met Adriana Vasco at her friend's house in Anaheim, California. Adriana was little, she was barely 5 feet tall, and she was quite thin. She was 33 years old and a single mother of 2 young kids. Over coffee at her kitchen table, Adriana told the detectives how she had become friends with Ken, a man who seemed to live in a completely different world than she did. She explained that Ken had noticed her walking with a limp when they were both working at the National Pain Institute. Ken had offered to inject pain medication into her back to correct the limp, but he told her it would be an ongoing procedure. At the kitchen table, Adriana took a sip of her coffee, and then a smile came across her face. She said she had agreed to the procedure, and as the pain injections continued, the two of them started getting a bit closer. Adriana said she had even begun calling him Ken instead of Dr. Stahl, and Ken had clearly taken a growing interest in Adriana's life. Then, when Adriana had split with her husband, Ken paid for her and her son to go live in a motel. When Adriana's car had broken down, Ken gave her money to buy a new one, a white Mazda. So Adriana told the detectives it became normal for her to turn to Ken for help because he was always so kind to her. And Adriana said that in return, she became a shoulder for Ken to cry on. He opened up to her about his unhappiness. He told her he hated the Orange County doctor's life. He thought it was totally phony. He said he had a lot more fun when he went to the beer and barbecue chicken restaurant, which was down the street from Adriana's apartment. Ken had even told Adriana at one point that she was his only real friend. Detectives MacDonald and Holmes sat on the edge of their seats, wanting to ask Adriana again if she was actually romantically involved with Ken. But they held their tongues and just let her talk. Adriana continued and said that Ken's marriage had been empty for years. He complained about his wife's looks and her weight, and he said they mostly slept in separate bedrooms. Then Adriana began to cry. She apologized and said she was still in shock over Ken's death. She said when she found out he died, it was like her whole world had just collapsed. Ken was like her hero. Finally, after Adriana wiped the tears from her face, she looked across the table at the detectives and she admitted that she had had an affair with Ken. And Ken's wife, Carolyn, knew about it. She told the detectives that about 3.5 years earlier, she had received a phone call from Ken, but the moment she answered, Ken quickly handed the phone off to his wife, Carolyn, and Carolyn's message to Adriana was blunt: "Stay away from my husband." Adriana said she broke off the affair soon after getting that phone call. She knew Ken would never divorce his wife, and she didn't want to get hurt. But she and Ken had remained friends even when Adriana found a new romantic partner and even had a daughter with him. In fact, Adriana said that Ken would sometimes go out to dinner with Adriana's new guy. Also, Adriana said after they split up, Ken never tried to have sex with her again. And she told the detectives that she really believed that Ken and Carolyn had genuinely started to work on their marriage at the time they got killed. And when she had spoken to Ken on the day he was killed, Adriana said he sounded happier than he had in months. McDonald and Holmes had more questions for Adriana, but the coffees were long since cold and it was after 5 p.m., so they thanked her for her time and they headed for the door. By the summer of 2000, the sensational double murder that had once gotten so much media attention was increasingly in danger of going cold. McDonald and Holmes had come away from their interview with Adriana convinced that her grief over Ken's death was actually sincere. She was probably lying about the length of their affair, but the detectives couldn't see why Adriana would want Ken dead. He had been a ready source of money and support to her for years. So the hope that one of Ken's lovers would lead them to the truth about the murders began to fade, and the detectives hadn't found any evidence that Ken had been blackmailed by anybody. Holmes and McDonald continued to pursue every possible lead, and they re-interviewed anyone who seemed to be remotely connected to the case, but their investigation stalled. In the fall of 2000, about 10 months after the murders, McDonald and Holmes were reassigned to another unit, and 2 new detectives, Brian Heaney and Phil Villalobos, took over Carolyn and Ken's murder case. Initially, the 2 new detectives felt totally overwhelmed. Villalobos had only been a homicide detective for 2 weeks, and Heaney's experience was mostly just in narcotics. But as they began to dig through the huge case file, they realized that their predecessors, McDonald and Holmes, were likely overwhelmed too. But something caught Detective Villalobos' eye as he reviewed Ken's cell phone records from the day of his death. Ken had called the same number 4 times, and the calls were to the same person who had paged Ken on the morning of the murders, Adriana Vasco. So Villalobos and Heaney quickly decided to pick up where the previous detectives had left off, and they turned their focus to Adriana. And at 8 p.m. on October 11th, almost 11 months after the murders, Adriana arrived at the sheriff's station for another interview. But this time, she was not eager to help. Adriana insisted that on the day of Ken's murder, she had only contacted him to talk about those computer repairs, and that the conversation was so innocuous that she couldn't even remember anything else they talked about. The 2 detectives pressed Adriana hard to get her to say more. Villalobos even asked her straight out who killed Ken. But Adriana broke into tears and said she had no idea and genuinely could not remember anything substantive from their last conversation. The detectives would question Adriana really aggressively for several hours until finally it was clear she just didn't have anything else to say, so they let her go. But the detectives were not quite finished with Adriana. After she left, the detectives rushed outside after her and hopped in their car and followed her. After driving for several minutes, Adriana arrived at a house where the father of one of her children was waiting for her. Adriana and this man had split up, but they remained close for the sake of their daughter. The detectives watched Adriana with this man from a distance, and they began to develop a new theory. Maybe Adriana did have nothing to do with Ken's death, but maybe this man who she was with, the father of her daughter, had gotten jealous of her affair with Ken, and maybe he lashed out. And so now maybe Adriana was doing everything she could to protect him, really just so her young daughter would not be without her father. Villalobos and Heaney waited for Adriana to leave, and then after she had, they hopped out of their car, walked up to the front door, knocked, and then when the man came to the door, they led him to the front yard to question him. And to the detective's surprise, this man was completely open and asked how he could help. Villalobos told him that he was convinced someone close to Adriana had killed Ken and Carolyn Stahl, but the detectives didn't know who. The man said that made sense to him, and he understood why they would want to question him, but then this man said something that sent Villalobos and Heaney reeling. He told them that he had nothing to do with Carolyn and Ken's murders, but he had a pretty good idea of who probably killed them. Villalobos just stared at him and then asked him outright, okay, who's the killer? And the man would say one word, Tony. The detectives were caught off guard. In all those files from nearly a year-long investigation, the name Tony had never once come up. Now they had someone telling them a guy named Tony was probably the killer they had been looking for. The detectives followed up with a bunch more questions about who this Tony person was, and they would learn that Tony was Adriana's current boyfriend, and he was a handyman at her apartment building. He also had a long criminal rap sheet, he had a temper, and he loved guns. A few days later, Detective Heaney was waiting in an unmarked car outside the hospital where Adriana worked. Investigators had been trying to track down Adriana's boyfriend, Tony, but the man seemed to have disappeared. So Heaney wanted Adriana to help them find him. Eventually, Adriana walked outside, still dressed in her scrubs, and right away Heaney rushed up to her and caught her completely by surprise. He asked her point blank if she would take a polygraph test right now. He said the test was all set up at the local police station right around the corner. All she had to do was come with him. Adriana was clearly shocked and pretty angry with Heaney for surprising her like this, but she did go with him to the police station. During the polygraph test, Adriana faced round after round of very difficult questions from Heaney and Villalobos, and Adriana held her ground, denying any knowledge of the murders. But then, Heaney hit her with a surprise question. He asked if Tony was the killer. She tried to deny knowing Tony, but it was already too late. The detectives knew he was her boyfriend and that she was lying to them. So Heaney began asking rapid-fire questions about Tony. Where was he? Did he know Ken? But Adriana collected herself, and she insisted she had no answers for them. But the detectives were convinced Adriana was now the key to unlocking this case, and too many people had been working for too long on this investigation to let this opportunity slip away. And it turned out the detectives had one more surprise for Adriana. There was an outstanding warrant for her arrest for driving with a suspended license, and they were going to use that to lock her up for the night. Adriana begged to be allowed to go home to her kids, but the detectives handcuffed her and led her to a cell. Now they just had to find Tony. Even after being locked up, Adriana did not tell the detectives where her boyfriend Tony was. But her phone bill showed that she had repeatedly called a number in Greenville, North Carolina over the past couple of days, and Detective Villalobos had a hunch that those were calls to Tony. Villalobos sent a picture of Tony to local police in Greenville, and right away an officer in Greenville contacted him and said he recognized Tony. He told Villalobos that Tony actually went by the name Dennis Godley in Greenville, but the local cops just called him the Weasel because he was so good at eluding arrest. However, the officer in Greenville said he would still be able to lead Villalobos and his partner right to Tony. So detectives Villalobos and Heaney headed right to the airport and took a flight from California to North Carolina. And while they were there, they did meet and interview Tony. However, he was totally uncooperative. He claimed that he had never been close to Adriana and that he had absolutely no role in the death of Ken and Carolyn Stahl. The detectives flew home feeling frustrated and with almost no new information, but their plan with Adriana had worked. After spending the night in jail and worrying she would not get to go home to her kids, she was now finally ready to tell the detectives everything she knew about Tony and everything she knew about Ken and Carolyn's murders. And by the time Adriana was finished talking, detectives Villalobos and Heaney were ready to make arrests in a case that had now gone on for almost a year. Based on Adriana's jail cell interview and evidence collected by both teams of detectives throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Carolyn and Ken Stahl out on Ortega Highway on November 20th, 1999. On that November day, the killer sat in the passenger seat of a parked car not far from the restaurant in San Juan Capistrano, where Ken and Carolyn were celebrating Carolyn's birthday. The killer calmly loaded their .357 Magnum and made small talk with the driver. But the driver wasn't listening. They had their eyes focused on the road right outside of the restaurant. Then the driver suddenly told the killer to be quiet. Ken's Dodge Stratus had just pulled out onto the road. The driver waited to let Ken's car get a little further away. Then the driver started their car, pulled out onto the road, and followed Ken. The driver tracked Ken onto Ortega Highway. The highway was dark and oddly quiet. The driver gripped the steering wheel tight and closed in on Ken. Meanwhile, the killer just kept talking like nothing out of the ordinary was even happening. Then at some point, Ken's car pulled off the highway into the breakdown lane near an emergency phone box. The driver told the killer it was time to act. Then the driver hit the gas, raced by Ken's car, and then did a U-turn into the breakdown lane. The driver's headlights were now shining directly into Ken's windshield. The driver put the car in park, and then the killer casually stepped out of the car. The killer walked right up to the driver's side window and tapped on the glass, and Ken rolled the window down. Ken was about to say something when the killer casually raised the .357 Magnum and fired. The bullet hit Ken behind the left ear and exited through his right eye. Carolyn began to scream from the passenger seat and tried to undo her seatbelt, but she was in shock and her hands were shaking and so she couldn't get free. The killer then fired another shot into Ken, and this time the bullet shredded his aorta, the body's main artery, and so blood sprayed all over the car and Ken slumped over, dead. Carolyn finally got her seatbelt off, but by this point, the killer stuck his gun through the open driver's side window and fired multiple shots point blank at Carolyn, hitting Carolyn in the chest. Carolyn screamed again and blood began to pour down her shirt, but she was still alive. So the killer aimed the gun at her and fired again, but they were out of bullets. So as Carolyn is sitting there slowly dying and screaming and looking at her dead husband, the killer walked back to the other car. They opened up the passenger side door, shouted something at the driver, and then grabbed extra ammunition from a bag on the floor. Then the killer calmly reloaded their gun and then turned back and began walking towards Ken's car again. By this point, the killer saw the passenger side door of the Dodge Stratus was now open. Carolyn tumbled out of the car, and one of her earrings fell to the ground. She was covered in blood and struggling to breathe, but she managed to brace herself against the back door of the car and stay on her feet. Carolyn looked around for any kind of escape route, but then she heard something behind her. She turned and saw the killer walking towards her with their gun raised. There was nowhere to go. In a last, desperate attempt to save herself, Carolyn dove back inside the car head first. One of her red shoes fell off as she struggled to pull herself across the front seat of the car over the body of her dead husband. She was trying to get to the driver's side so that maybe she could speed away and save herself. But the killer just walked to the open passenger door, aimed their gun at the back of Carolyn's head, and fired off 2 more shots. Carolyn fell over dead in Ken's lap. The killer leaned in to make sure both Ken and Carolyn were dead. Then they did a thorough sweep of the car and the road around it to make sure they picked up any stray evidence, like bullet casings. Finally, when the killer was satisfied, they walked back to the white Mazda that was still parked with its lights shining directly into Ken's car. Then the killer got back into the Mazda and looked over at the driver. And the driver was shaking and horrified. The killer told the driver to calm down and just get out of here. But the driver shouted at the killer that they were not supposed to kill Ken. The driver said she loved Ken, and Ken was actually the one who had paid them to murder his wife. It would turn out Adriana was the driver, and her boyfriend, Tony, had indeed pulled the trigger and killed Carolyn and Ken. But Ken had actually been the one who set the entire thing in motion. It turned out Ken had wanted his wife dead for a long time. He wanted to be free to have relationships with lots of women without any repercussions and just to live his life however he wanted. But Ken felt like he was reliant on Carolyn. She took care of him and she made a lot of money, so if his health issues kept him from working again, he would still be able to live well because of Carolyn. Ken went so far as to tell some people that Carolyn had control of his life, and it was like he was being blackmailed just to stay in the marriage, even though that was just not true. But finally, Ken told Adriana that he had just had enough. and he asked her to help him murder his wife. Adriana said her boyfriend Tony would be perfect for the job. He was good with guns and calm in any situation. So Ken paid Adriana and Tony $30,000 to carry out a hit on Carolyn. And Ken and Adriana hammered out all of the details, including the exact location on Ortega Highway where Ken would pull over and the murder would go down. On the day of the murder, Ken had contacted Adriana multiple times to let her know when he and Carolyn were heading to the restaurant, and then when they arrived, and then also when they were leaving. And Adriana and Tony had been waiting nearby to follow him to the spot they'd agreed on. But when it came time to actually do the job, Tony took things into his own hands. He didn't trust Ken, and he didn't want the middle-aged doctor around to pin the whole thing on him. So Tony decided to just kill Ken too. Carolyn was truly just an innocent victim. Her husband had plotted against her and had even tried to paint her as some kind of blackmailing monster. But Carolyn's friends and family knew that despite all of Ken's cheating, Carolyn still loved him, and she still believed they could repair their marriage. But Ken had no intention of doing that. At trial, Adriana insisted that she tried to talk Ken out of going through with the shooting, and that she ultimately only went along with it because she was afraid of Tony. But ultimately, a jury would convict her of masterminding the entire murder plot and sentenced her to life in prison without parole. As for Tony, he would ultimately plead guilty to the murders in exchange for a life sentence instead of the death penalty. And Tony would insist to the very end that Adriana was the one who shot Carolyn, not him. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts: Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runfool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On a June night in 1997, Kathy Peters was asleep at her home in Mirror Lake, a quiet neighborhood of Sarasota, Florida. Around 3:45 a.m., she was startled awake by a strange noise. It was unlike anything Kathy had heard, a faint, eerie, rattling hiss. After a few seconds, the sound faded, and Kathy tried to go back to sleep. But now she was too anxious. So she got up and crossed to the window. She opened the blinds and looked across the lake's glassy surface. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then she nearly jumped out of her skin when a loud metallic banging noise sounded right below her window. Somebody was pounding on her screen door. Kathy ran downstairs, having no idea who could be bothering her at this time of the night. She considered not answering, but Mirror Lake was a very safe community, so there had to be a reasonable explanation here. So she opened the door. Through the screen, she could see someone standing in the darkness. Kathy asked who it was and what they wanted, but the figure didn't say anything. Now, Kathy was terrified, so she switched on the porch light, and when she saw what was in front of her, she reeled back in horror. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please remember, before you do anything mean to the follow button, walk a mile in their shoes. That way, when you bully them, you're a mile away and you have their shoes. Okay, let's get into today's story. June 20th, 1997 started out as a perfect day for Henry Kneva. The wiry, silver-mustached 76-year-old arrived at the Toyota dealership in Sarasota shortly after dawn. Getting to work early meant that he got first pick of the morning customers, which was how he liked it. By lunch, he'd already made 2 sales, and he was working on his third. And when that third customer signed for her car, Henry handed her the keys and felt that familiar rush of victory. He'd worked plenty of jobs throughout his life, but selling cars was the first thing that he truly loved, and he was really good at it. Henry had an effortless charm and a sort of unthreatening quality that made people trust him. He enjoyed talking to strangers, and he had no plans of slowing down or retiring. Growing up in the Great Depression had imprinted on him a set of unshakable values. He believed that you should work hard, save every dime you can, and treat every day like it's your last. And that mindset had served him well over the years. But life still had come with plenty of setbacks. 2 decades ago, his marriage had fallen apart, and so he'd upended his life and moved from California to Florida. Finding a new job there had been easy with Henry's sales experience, but he had not expected to find love again, too. He'd met his current girlfriend, Janet Scott, a little over 6 years earlier, when Janet had come into Henry's dealership looking to buy a car. She'd left with a car, and also with Henry's phone number. Their relationship quickly progressed from friendly dinners to romance. And Janet never seemed to mind that she was 26 years younger than Henry. She laughed at his jokes, loved his cooking, and put up with his constant car talk. Janet was also a salesperson in her own way. She worked at the Hallmark store at the Sarasota Square Mall, selling cards, chocolates, and stuffed animals. And that day, while Henry was getting ready to sell his third car, Janet was helping a shopper pick out a condolences card for a funeral. As she pulled different options from the rack, Janet couldn't help but feel a twinge of heartache. It was not that long ago that her own mailbox had been flooded with cards like these. Just before she met Henry, her husband, Roe, had died from a heart attack. Janet still wore the diamond engagement ring that Roe had given her, right next to the inexpensive topaz one that Henry had gotten her a few years earlier. She was comfortable in her relationship with Henry, but she knew not to expect a wedding ring from him. Henry had never actually gotten around to filing divorce paperwork for his first marriage, so he was still legally married to his ex in California, and they had 2 adult kids together, a son and a daughter. But Henry hardly ever spoke to his kids these days, which made Janet sad. She'd seen the same thing happen to her late husband. Roe had had an adult daughter from a former marriage, and they'd grown distant after Roe married Janet. Janet thought that Roe had regretted not repairing that relationship before he died, and so she didn't want Henry to die without getting a chance to patch things up with his kids. But she wasn't sure how to help him do that. As upbeat and charming as Henry was, he could also be very private and stuck in his ways. But Janet took a last look at the condolence card her customer chose and resolved to talk to Henry about his kids that night. After purchasing their card, the customer left, and Janet began closing up the store. 20 minutes later, she was driving past sandy white beaches teeming with senior citizens. Sarasota was a magnet for people like Henry, looking to spend their twilight years in the Florida sun. Pretty soon, Janet reached the peaceful neighborhood of Mirror Lake. Janet's spacious one-story house was at the very end of the road, with a red back door looking out to the water. Her late husband, Roe, had lived there with his first family before he met Janet, and then Janet lived there throughout their marriage, and she inherited the place when Roe died. Now, because Roe literally had died in this house, initially, Janet felt hesitant about the idea of letting Henry move in. But Henry had eventually sold her on the idea of him moving in by pointing out how much money they would save if he gave up his apartment. And so he moved in. When Janet walked in the door, she was immediately hit with a delicious smell wafting in from the kitchen. She smiled as she watched Henry move about the kitchen, dashing over for a kiss before hurrying back to the oven. Any discomfort that she might have felt about Henry living here in Roe's old house clearly was not shared. Henry had made himself right at home. After dinner, Janet cuddled on the couch with Henry and her dog Kissy while they watched some local news. And then, around 11 p.m., she remembered her plan to talk to Henry about his kids. But when she looked over at Henry, she could see he was already drifting off to sleep, So Janet switched off the TV and sent her fiancé to bed. The conversation could wait. Janet took Kissy out to the backyard for a quick walk, and then after coming back inside, she headed to their bedroom, where she removed her rings and set them on the nightstand before climbing into bed beside Henry. The next thing Janet knew, she was dragged from sleep by this blinding pain. And then her surprise gave way to terror when she realized someone was sitting on top of her, pinning her to the bed with their knees while twisting at her neck. Janet started to scream and thrash, but her attacker just punched her repeatedly in the head and chest. Janet tasted blood and started to black out, but she kept struggling trying to get free. And suddenly, she and her attacker fell off the bed and hit the floor. But before she could get back to her feet, she felt a pull on her legs, and her attacker was right back on top of her, squeezing at her throat. Janet made a final attempt to push her attacker off, but by this point, she was exhausted and disoriented, and slowly, everything went black. Sometime later, Janet woke up on her bedroom floor. Her temple and her throat throbbed with pain, but her attacker was gone. At least they weren't on top of her anymore, and she couldn't see anybody else in the room. Janet lifted her head, trying her best to ignore the pain. She couldn't see much, since it was pitch black in the room and one of her eyes was swollen shut. But as she sat up, Janet heard something, a hoarse, raspy wheezing sound. She didn't know where the sound was coming from or what it could be. All she knew was she needed to get away right now. Painfully, she got up and fumbled through the dark until she found the landline phone on the small vanity table. She picked it up to call the police, but the line was dead. And so Janet left the phone and staggered down the hall and went out the back door. And from there, she headed over to her neighbor's home. When she got there, she desperately banged on the door until her neighbor, a woman named Kathy Peters, answered. And when the neighbor, Kathy, looked out and saw Janet standing there with her shattered face, she was so surprised that she immediately jumped backwards in fright. Janet was actually so bruised and bloodied that Kathy did not recognize her at first. But when she realized who was standing there, she pulled Janet inside, locked the door, and ran to call 911. An ambulance arrived within minutes to take Janet to the hospital, and not a moment too soon. Even as the EMTs loaded her onto the stretcher, she was already losing consciousness again. At almost the same time, several sheriff's deputies arrived at Janet's house. They found the back door unlocked, and so they headed inside. The moment they entered the master bedroom, the deputies knew there had been an extremely violent attack here. Drawers had been pulled from the dresser and dumped all over the floor. There was blood spatter on the blinds and all over the sheets, and a thick puddle of blood was on the floor right where Janet fell. And there, lying on the bed, was Henry. His face was covered in blood, and he had a belt cinched tightly around his neck. The deputies checked him for a pulse, but the man was obviously dead from strangulation. After discovering Henry's body, the deputies began searching the room. One of the deputies was down on his hands and knees, peering under the bed, when he got startled by a pair of eyes staring back at him. It was Janet's dog, Kissy, cowering under the bed, shaking in terror. She refused to come out when the deputy called to her, so he crawled under and pulled her out. Once the deputy had the dog in his arms, it became clear that Kissy was not just terrified. Her eyes were dilated like she had a concussion, and there was some blood around her head, suggesting she had been beaten too. One of the deputies volunteered to take Kissy to a local pet hospital, and as he was leaving with the dog, another car pulled up and two men got out. They were Mark Brewer and Keith Muncy, detectives from the Sarasota Police Homicide Division who would now be taking lead on the case. The two detectives headed inside to join the deputies, who quickly brought them up to speed. Right away, they were struck by the brutality of Henry's murder. He'd been strangled to death with his own belt while he was sleeping, and he'd also been badly beaten. The sheer violence that must have been involved here gave this crime a very personal feeling. The detectives also noticed that while the bedroom had been ransacked, it didn't seem like anything had been taken. For example, Henry's wallet with some money and credit cards in it was just out on a dresser. And so this made the detectives think that this probably was not a robbery. Next, they checked the landline phone, which was still lying off the hook where Janet had dropped it. The line was dead, so Detective Muncie headed out to the backyard, where he confirmed that the phone lines had been cut. He was heading back inside when a flash of white on the ground caught his eye. It was a cigarette butt, lying at the edge of the property. And while the grass was wet from some light rain earlier that night, this cigarette butt was dry, meaning it had been dropped within the last few hours. Muncie went inside to share this discovery with Detective Brewer, and after doing so, it would turn out Brewer also had some news of his own. He had found the fingertip of a latex glove in the bedroom. The detectives now had 2 pieces of evidence that might have the killer's fingerprints or DNA material on them. But the lab was backed up, and so testing these items would take time. And so they were hoping that long before they needed the results of those tests, their eyewitnesses could actually just help them solve the crime. So they headed to the hospital to interview the one person, aside from the killer, who was there when Henry was murdered, Janet. Unfortunately, though, when they arrived at the hospital, Janet was unconscious again. And also, one of the doctors warned that with the extent of the injuries she'd sustained, she could actually die. And so Brewer and Muncie were suddenly facing the possibility of a double murder. They asked the hospital staff to call them if Janet woke up. In the meantime, the detectives began digging into Henry's life to try and understand why someone had wanted to kill him. When they got access to his bank accounts, they were surprised by just how much money Henry had put away. Henry sort of gave off the vibe that he was a senior citizen on a limited fixed budget. But in reality, he had $700,000 in the bank. So the detective speculated that maybe Henry was killed for his money. And their thoughts immediately turned toward Henry's relatives, who were most likely to gain financially from his death. The detectives learned that Henry did not have a will, but that only meant that the bulk of the inheritance would be divided between his adult children, Jeff and Sharon Kneva. When the detectives reached out to Jeff and Sharon, they learned that they were actually already on their way to Sarasota after learning their father had been killed. And at the detectives' request, they agreed to stop by the station to answer some questions. Brewer and Muncie knew it was impossible for Jeff or Sharon to have been present for the murder, since they were across the country in California when it happened. But that did not stop them from potentially arranging a hit through a third party. The detectives pressed the siblings about how they got along with their father. And both Jeff and Sharon said they were on good terms with Henry, but they didn't really talk to him very much. Not because they didn't want to. Jeff clearly idolized his father and had even followed in his father's footsteps to become a car salesman. But they said their father liked his privacy and didn't want many visitors. He seemed happy with the new life he'd built in Florida, so they tried to give him space and let him be. But then Jeff dropped some truly shocking information. A few months earlier, he had called his father at home, and a young man had answered. When Jeff asked who he was talking to, the man said he was Henry's son. Jeff was initially stunned and very confused because he believed he was Henry's only son. But eventually, the truth came out. Soon after Henry had separated from Jeff and Sharon's mother and moved to Florida, he was in a very brief relationship with a woman who gave birth to Henry's other son, David. But Henry never told anybody about David, and Henry himself didn't even meet him until David had grown up and tracked him down. But from what Jeff was able to gather, it seemed like Henry and his son David had seen a lot of each other in the months leading up to the murder. It stung more than Jeff liked to admit, both because Henry had kept David's existence a secret and because he'd been so unavailable to his other kids. Following the conversation with Jeff and his sister Sharon, detectives Brewer and Muncie got to work tracking David down. They learned that he was 20 years old and lived about 3 hours away in the Daytona Beach area. When they contacted him, he agreed to come down to Sarasota for questioning. And during his interview, he admitted that he knew Henry had a lot of money, but didn't know how much or if Henry had a will. David confirmed that he had been spending more time with Henry recently, and that some of the visits had taken place at the house in Mirror Lake, where the murder took place. Most recently, David said he and Henry had watched sports together on TV on Father's Day. which happened to be just 4 days before Henry was killed. All these details made the detectives suspicious of David. After all those years without seeing his father, David was suddenly spending lots of time with him? Was he trying to get Henry's money? Did he secretly nurse a deep grudge against Henry? Either way, David did know his way around Henry's home, and also David was a big man who'd be quite physically capable of strangling a sleeping 76-year-old. David's alibi for the night of the murder was also pretty weak. David told the detectives that he was with his girlfriend that night. And while she did confirm that was true, Brewer and Muncie knew she could just be lying for him. So, ultimately, the detectives pressured David to take a polygraph test. And the results came back inconclusive. Now, of course, polygraph tests are not 100% accurate. I mean, people can lie and they can fake their answers, and a positive result could actually be a negative and vice versa. But at a minimum, an inconclusive test meant that David remained very much a potential suspect. The detectives were still interested in Henry's other 2 children as well, and Henry's funeral, held about a week after the murder, gave the detectives a chance to observe all 3 kids together. And right away, Brewer and Muncie could see there was almost palpable tension between David, Jeff, and Sharon. And also, they could overhear very testy conversations between the siblings. At one point, David commented that he was looking forward to buying jet skis with his inheritance. This did not go over well with Jeff, who was already feeling very jealous about Henry spending his last Father's Day with David instead of him, and so he got angry and accused David of being involved in the murder. David walked away before the argument could go any further, and for the remainder of the funeral, the siblings basically avoided each other. The detectives agreed it was not that surprising that the siblings didn't get along. However, them not getting along did not necessarily mean they killed their father. But regardless, Brewer and Muncie decided to still keep an eye on all of Henry's children while they simultaneously dug into his other relationships. The following day, the detectives headed to the Toyota dealership where Henry worked to interview some of his colleagues. And one of Henry's buddies, a guy named Red, was more than happy to help. Red said the other salesmen definitely respected Henry due to his long history in the business, but they also saw him as being pretty old-fashioned and would sometimes give him a hard time about being cheap. They couldn't understand why he wore old, ill-fitting clothes and drove a 10-year-old car when they knew he had money. It was common knowledge around the dealership that Henry had made more than the rest of them put together, just from the number of cars Henry had sold. As one salesman put it, Henry had, quote, more money than God. The detectives jotted all this down and then asked Red if there was anyone on the staff who might have wanted to harm Henry. Red thought for a moment and then told them they should go talk to a guy named Mark. Red explained that Mark was a younger salesman who had worked at the dealership until recently. He was argumentative and lazy and would often miss work, sometimes disappearing for as much as a week at a time. Mark's laziness really rubbed Henry the wrong way, and at one point he had tried to talk some sense into Mark, but Mark just sort of blew him off. And soon after that, Mark was abruptly fired, just a few days before Henry's murder. Now, Red didn't know if Henry had formally complained to management, which sort of led to Mark's firing, but Red said, Henry had been vocal enough about his dislike of Mark that most of the other employees assumed that Henry must have had something to do with Mark's firing. The detectives interviewed more of the salesmen and heard similar stories. Some people thought Mark was actually a drug addict, and that was why he disappeared sometimes. And a few of the salesmen recounted that Mark had been looking for a gun right around the time he got fired. He had told them he needed it to, quote, take care of something. Armed with all these stories, Detectives Brewer and Muncie tracked down Mark and brought him into the Sarasota police station for questioning. Mark had a bad attitude right away and acted annoyed at them for wasting his time. While Mark said he did not know anything about Henry's murder, he also said that yes, he and Henry had butted heads. He said that Henry wanted to be treated like the dealership king simply because he'd been there the longest. Mark said that Henry was always butting into other people's business, and as far as Mark was concerned, Henry had gotten what he deserved. Naturally, Brewer and Muncie found this kind of talk extremely suspicious, so they pressed Mark harder. They told him that they'd found a latex glove fragment at the crime scene with fingerprints on it. Now, this was a total bluff on their part. They'd already analyzed that glove fragment, and it was clean of prints. But Mark didn't know that. And if he was guilty, thinking that the police had hard evidence could make him crack. But instead, Mark responded somewhat sarcastically, saying that, yeah, finding that glove at the scene would make me a good suspect, because my sister is a nurse, and so I have access to gloves just like that. The detectives thought this was a very strange thing to say, even if it was sarcastic. I mean, Mark was technically incriminating himself in a murder investigation, but Mark just did not seem to care. Brewer and Muncie just sat there, trying to make sense of what Mark had just said, when they got a call from the hospital. Janet was awake, and it looked like she was going to survive. And while she was still weak and in a lot of pain, she had said she was ready to answer their questions. The detectives were so eager to hear from her that they let Mark go for the moment and raced over to the hospital. But when they finally sat down with Janet, it became clear she was not going to be as helpful as they'd hoped. Janet was not just beaten up, she was severely traumatized and confused about what had happened. Doctors said the first thing that she had asked when she regained consciousness was, "Where's Henry?" When Brewer and Muncie gently pressed her to try to focus and remember any details, she tried, but then suddenly got this crushing headache and had to stop. And then a couple of minutes later, when her headache kind of faded, she told them that all she could remember was being beaten and strangled by this faceless dark figure, and then a little bit after that, she remembered waking up on the ground, hearing this horrible rattling wheezing sound. To help jog her memory, Brewer showed Janet some crime scene photos of the bedroom that were taken after the attack. Janet looked closely at all the pictures, but still, she just could not remember anything else. However, she did notice something in one of the photos. Her 2 rings that she had placed on the nightstand were missing. And so at this point, the detectives knew that perhaps the stolen rings indicated that this was a robbery after all. Maybe the killer was planning to take more, but got spooked by the dogs barking and ran. But on the other hand, the fact that just these rings appeared to be missing and that they had sentimental value could point to a personal connection between the killer and the victims. As important as Janet's realization about the rings was, it didn't really provide the detectives with any new clear answers. Their investigation so far had turned up some strong suspects, including Mark, the shady car salesman, and the 3 Kneva children, Jeff, Sharon, and their half-brother David, but as it stood, police did not have enough evidence to build a case against any one of them. So all the detectives could do now was just keep an eye on the suspects and hope that Janet's memory improved. But weeks and then months passed with no progress in the case or any change to Janet's memory, and so the investigation began to go cold. Then, in December of 1997, a full 6 months after Henry's murder, a clue dropped into the detectives' laps that changed everything. In a seemingly unrelated case, Sarasota police deputies responded to a domestic violence call at another house on Mirror Lake, across the water from Janet's place. This was not the first time they'd had to break up a fight at this home. A few months earlier, 39-year-old John Whiteley had pinned his girlfriend, 40-year-old Leila Hodges, between the washing machine and the wall, trapping her there. Leila had forgiven him for that incident, but now he'd attacked her again. And as the police once again separated the couple, John got the impression that he was about to be placed under arrest. And so he shouted that Leila had better keep her mouth shut and not accuse him of anything, or else he would tell them about the rings. Then, as if to prove he wasn't bluffing, he shouted to the deputies, "Hey, you guys want to know something about a murder?" Now, at this point, after John had said all this stuff, the deputies were all thinking of the same thing: Henry's murder case. Now, they all knew that 2 rings had been taken from the crime scene, but that detail had never been made public, which meant this couple, specifically John, might actually know something about Henry's murder. As soon as Detective Brewer and Muncie got word about John and Leila, they were convinced the couple must have had something to do with Henry's murder. They just couldn't figure out how John and Leela were connected to him. So, out of desperation, they decided to go back and talk to Janet one last time. Unfortunately, Janet still could not remember anything more about the attack. So, Brewer and Muncie came up with an idea. They were going to try to hypnotize her. It was unorthodox, but at this point, they were willing to try anything, and Janet was on board. So, the next day, the detectives returned, now with a hypnotist, who put Janet into a trance. And then while she was in her trance, they asked her a series of questions, designed to draw out her repressed memories from the attack. And suddenly, it was like Janet could hear and see things from the night of the attack that she hadn't been able to before. Finally, when the hypnotist asked her to describe her attacker, Janet grew quiet. She still could not picture their face, but she did remember something else. Under hypnosis, Janet recalled waking up to find a large shadowy figure sitting on her thighs while violently grabbing her neck. Janet tried to fight, but it didn't do any good. Then, as the killer continued to throttle her, she became aware of another set of hands on her shoulders. A second person that she couldn't see was holding her to the ground. That meant there were 2 attackers in the bedroom that night, not just one. Janet's revelation stunned the detectives at first, but they quickly realized several of their suspects came in pairs. The first pair was Henry's first set of kids, Jeff and Sharon. They stood to benefit the most from Henry's death, as they knew they would inherit a portion of his small fortune. But that also applied to David, Jeff and Sharon's 20-year-old half-brother. David's girlfriend had provided him with an alibi. Now, the detectives wondered if maybe she'd help David commit the crime, thinking his inheritance would benefit her too, making David and her a pair. The third set of suspects was John and Leela, the couple from the domestic abuse call. While they didn't seem to have a motive, or even really a connection, they lived nearby and seemed to know information that was not shared with the public. The only suspect who did not come with a potential accomplice was Mark, the salesman who was fired days before the murder. While it was still possible that he had killed Henry over a grudge, or maybe as part of a robbery, the detective still had no idea who he would have worked with. That night, after leaving the hospital, Brewer and Muncie holed up in their office and read through the files for each set of suspects, searching for any detail they might have missed. And they were starting to lose steam when Muncie stumbled upon something that made him pause. It was a single word buried in one of the suspects' files. Muncie showed it to Brewer, who immediately jumped to his computer to pull up more details on that suspect. And as his screen filled with information, everything began to fall into place. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Henry Kneva and Janet Scott on the night of June 20th, 1997. A little before 3 a.m., 2 figures crept along the bank of Mirror Lake. They were wearing black clothes and latex gloves, and the leader was smoking a cigarette. As they reached the edge of Janet's property, the leader put out the cigarette and dropped it into the wet grass. Then the pair hurried across the lawn to the house, where the leader used pliers to cut the phone line that was running along the exterior wall. They found the back door was unlocked, so they slipped inside. Once inside, the accomplice led the way to the master bedroom, where they found Henry and Janet fast asleep in bed. But the couple was not alone. Janet's dog, Kissy, was lying at her feet. When the killers entered, the dog jumped off the bed and began barking. The accomplice stepped forward and delivered a powerful kick that sent Kissy flying against the wall. She fell down and went limp. The killers quickly glanced back over at the bed, and they were relieved to see that Janet and Henry were still asleep. So they moved ahead with their plan. The leader found a pair of pants on the floor, pulled out the leather belt, and then climbed on top of Henry. As Henry began to stir, the leader struck him several times in the face and then wrapped the belt around his neck and began to pull it tight. At the same time, the accomplice jumped on top of Janet and straddled her and began to beat her. Janet woke up and screamed and began fighting as hard as she could to get free, and one of Janet's wild punches caught the accomplice in the nose, causing them to reel back in surprise. And as a result, the accomplice and Janet both tumbled out of the bed onto the floor. By this point, the leader had finished with Henry, so they climbed off the bed and rushed around to help the accomplice. Together, they grabbed Janet and pinned her down, and then the leader climbed on top of her. Then the leader struck her several more times and then wrapped their hands around her neck and squeezed. The leader felt Janet go limp, at which point they said, "That should do it," as they climbed off of her. The killers looked at their handiwork and turned to go. On their way out, though, the accomplice spotted Janet's rings sitting on the nightstand, and they recognized one of the rings in an instant, and the sight of it made them furious. So, the accomplice impulsively grabbed both rings and stuffed them into their pocket, then turned and dashed out of the room along with the leader. The killers had only been gone a few minutes when Janet regained consciousness, feeling excruciating pain across her body. She could hear the strange, horrible rattling hiss and didn't know what it could be. Even as she lay there, her mind was already struggling to bury the horrible trauma she had just experienced. That's why she didn't remember until her hypnosis session that she'd actually been attacked by 2 people, and that one of them was actually somebody that she knew. It would turn out the killers were John Whiteley and Leila Hodges, the couple from the domestic abuse call. And just as Brewer and Muncie had suspected, these two did have a personal connection to the victims. However, the connection was not really to Henry, it was to Janet. When the detectives reviewed their case file, that single word that stuck out to them was Leila's maiden name. Leila had been married several times and had taken multiple last names, but she'd been born Leila Scott. She was no stranger to Janet. She was Janet Scott's stepdaughter. Leila was the daughter of Janet's late husband, Roe, from his first marriage. She grew up in the house on Mirror Lake where Janet and Henry lived together, and she hated them because she always thought that house should have gone to her when her dad died. Leila felt similarly about Janet's diamond ring. It was the same ring her father had given to his first wife, Leila's mother, which means, all along, the detectives were wrong about their most basic assumption. Henry was not the primary target of the attack. Janet was. And Leila's deep hatred of Janet explained the brutality of the attack. As a small older man, Henry didn't stand a chance, and Janet was lucky to be alive. She was beaten and choked so badly that her larynx was crushed. That horrible wheezing hiss she heard when she woke up on the floor, that was her own labored breathing. Once Detective Brewer and Muncie put this all together, they had John and Leila arrested. John's DNA was tested, and it matched the DNA found on the cigarette butt that was at the crime scene. The leader during the actual attack itself was John, and Leila was the accomplice. However, the true mastermind behind this attack was Leila. The couple took a plea deal and received a sentence of 20 years. As for Janet Scott, her physical and psychological trauma persisted for much longer than 20 years. Her voice and eyesight never completely returned to full strength. Fortunately, though, her beloved dog, Kissy, would make a full recovery and lived a long, happy life. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the MrBallen podcast, and there's MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On April 18, 1992, a person in California turned their shower on and waited until the steam was rising up out of the stall before they stepped inside. Once under the water, this person grabbed a can of shaving cream and applied it to their entire body. And slowly, they began shaving off every hair on their body except for the hair on their head. After they were done, they hopped out of the shower, they toweled off, got dressed, and then began the next phase of their prep, packing their backpack with things like latex gloves and plastic sheets. After they were done, they climbed into bed and set their alarm for very early the next morning. They were nervous about what was going to happen the next day, but they were confident that they were ready. 24 hours later, and what this hairless person had done was all over the news. But before we get into that story, I want to tell you about my absolute favorite storytelling show. It's called Bedtime Stories, and it's truly one of the most entertaining and mind-bending, terrifying shows I have ever heard, and they have a truly incredible storyteller. And here's a bit of exclusive news. It's been handpicked by me to become our very first non-MrBallen hosted podcast under the Ballen Studios banner. And the show is live right now with the first 3 episodes. You can listen to Bedtime Stories right here on Amazon Music. So, if that's of interest to you, right before the Amazon review button lays down to go to bed, put on my new favorite show, Bedtime Stories, and scare the absolute crap out of it. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Friday, April 17, 1993, 59-year-old millionaire Dale Ewell was flying his Beechcraft Bonanza single-engine airplane thousands of feet above Fresno, California. Dale was a handsome man with blue eyes and dark hair that was starting to turn gray. He was flying his plane from where he lived in Fresno to a small airport about 45 minutes away because he was going to meet his wife and kids at the family's beach house for Easter weekend. In the cockpit, Dale looked out at the clear blue sky and listened to the hum of the plane's engine, and suddenly any stress he might have been dealing with just kind of disappeared. Airplanes had been a huge part of Dale's life for almost 40 years, and he never felt better than when he was flying. In the 1950s, Dale had flown twin-engine turboprop planes as a member of the United States Air Force, and then after he left the military, Dale had gotten a job selling small airplanes to private pilots and California ranchers for a company owned by a man named Frank Lamb. Frank had taken Dale under his wing and taught him everything he could about the airplane industry, and Dale had turned out to be a very gifted airplane salesman. Part of Dale's skill as a salesman was that he was very charming, and he felt comfortable talking to all kinds of people, but really the main reason Dale had been so successful at selling planes was because his love of being a pilot really rubbed off on people. And when he talked to potential clients about the peace and the awe he felt when he was flying, they wanted to experience the same thing. And so Dale had quickly moved up the company ladder, and when Frank had stepped away from the business 20 years earlier, Dale had taken over and become the owner and president of the company. Once Dale was in charge, he had started making a lot of money, and he invested that money really well. So in 1992, as Dale approached his 60th birthday, he was worth about $8 million, which would be over $17 million in 2023. When Dale got to be about 20 miles away from the airport where he was going, he radioed air traffic control and got clearance to make his final approach. Dale descended to an altitude of about 2,000 feet and then started the landing procedure. And when he touched down on the runway, he was already looking forward to flying again in a couple of days. But first, he was eager to spend some time relaxing with his family. Dale got into a car that he had arranged to have waiting for him at the airport, and then he drove a few miles to Pajaro Dunes, a small upscale beachfront community in Northern California. He made his way down a secluded street, past large homes that looked out onto the Pacific Ocean, and then finally he pulled up to his own beach house, he parked his car, and stepped outside. His wife, Glee, and his daughter, Tiffany, were sitting on the porch waiting for him. Glee and Tiffany had driven to the beach house together the day before. Glee, who had short brown hair and a big smile, stood up and kissed her husband when he stepped onto the porch. Glee and Dale had been married for 31 years, and when they had started making a lot of money, Glee had really committed herself to community service and philanthropy. And so as a result, back in Fresno where they lived, Glee was admired as a community leader. But Glee had a past that most people in Fresno didn't know anything about. She was extremely smart and she had a talent for speaking foreign languages. And in the late 1950s, before she and Dale had gotten married, Glee's skills had landed her a job in South America as a translator for the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, which is a federal agency in the United States that specializes in foreign intelligence. Glee's children thought it was exciting that their mom had once worked for the CIA, but Glee thought about her time in South America like it was from a different life. On the porch, Glee and Dale's daughter, Tiffany, got up and hugged her dad. Then she opened the door, and they all went inside the beach house. Tiffany was 24 years old, with cropped blonde hair and a smile that was almost identical to her mother's. She was quiet and reserved around people she didn't know, and in fact, she'd been named the shyest person in class when she was in college. But Tiffany's family and her few close friends knew she was funny and sweet and a great person to talk to once she'd let her guard down. So Dale, Glee, and Tiffany spent a lot of that day just talking to each other, and their main topic of conversation was the youngest member of the family, Dana, and his new girlfriend, Monica Zent. The two had met at their dorm at Santa Clara University, which was a little over an hour from the beach house. And the next day, Dana was supposed to bring Monica out to the beach house to meet the rest of his family. The following morning, 20-year-old Dana Ewell pulled up to the front of the beach house in his gold Mercedes-Benz, and he, along with his girlfriend, Monica, got out of the car and walked towards the front door. Dana was tall and thin with dark brown hair, and this day he wore a t-shirt and jeans. But that outfit was actually kind of unusual for him. Most of the time, when Dana went anywhere, even to his college classes, he wore a tailored Armani suit, which is very fancy. Dana looked up to his father, and he really wanted to be successful like his dad was, and so he thought it was important to dress the part. Dana and Monica walked inside the beach house, and Dana right away called out for his parents. Monica looked around the large front room and listened to the sound of the ocean just outside, and she was kind of in shock. Monica's father was an FBI agent, so she had not grown up around people who had as much money as Dana and his family. So the gold Mercedes, the beachfront property, the airplanes, and the whole lifestyle the Ewells led was just all so new to her. Dale, Glee, and Tiffany came into the front room from the kitchen and said hello to Dana and Monica. Then Glee asked Monica to go on a tour of the beach house, really just so Glee could get to know her son's new girlfriend a little bit better. And later that day, while Monica was spending time with Glee and also with Tiffany, Dana and Dale went to play tennis on a court that was reserved just for residents of this small beach community. As they played, Dale talked to his son about the airplane business, but he really wanted to hear about how Dana was doing at school. Dana said classes were going great and that he really liked his girlfriend, Monica, so he was excited that the family was finally getting to meet her. Dana also said that he really hoped the entire family would get to spend more time together as a whole once this semester was over. And then the two of them started talking about their favorite topic, flying. Dana said that he wanted to get into piloting helicopters, so his dad, Dale, said they should find a good place for him to take lessons that was not too far from school. They played tennis for a bit longer, and then they headed back to the beach house. Later that night, a few hours after dinner, Dale and his wife Glee were lying in bed, and they began talking about how lucky they were to have this beach house, this really nice place where the whole family could go and spend time together and just kind of be away from everything for a little while. Glee said that she knew the kids were growing up and they had their own lives and interests, but she just hoped that Dana and Tiffany would keep coming to the beach house even when they were older and had families of their own. On April 19th, the following day, Dale helped his wife and his daughter load up Glee's gray Cadillac with the suitcases and cooler of food that they had brought to the beach. Dana and Monica were going to have Easter dinner with Monica's parents, so they had already left. Once Glee's car was loaded, Dale gave his wife and his daughter a kiss and told them he'd see them when he got home. Then Dale got into his own car and drove to the airport so he could fly his plane back to Fresno. Tiffany climbed into the passenger seat of the Cadillac, and Glee got behind the wheel. and then a couple of minutes later, they began their drive back home. It would take them 3 hours to complete the drive, but they made a pit stop about halfway through and grabbed some food at a fast food restaurant called Foster's Freeze, which was Tiffany's favorite place to get a milkshake. Finally, at about 5 p.m., Glee and Tiffany pulled into the driveway of their large ranch-style house in a secluded, wealthy neighborhood in Fresno. The house had a sprawling front yard that was beautifully landscaped with huge trees and a stone fountain in the center of the yard. Glee opened the garage door and pulled the Cadillac inside. Dale's car wasn't there, but that didn't surprise her. Even though the flight Dale had made was short, Glee knew he would spend some time at the airport making sure everything was all right with his plane. Tiffany got out of the car. She was carrying her drink from Foster's Freeze. Glee went around to the back seat, grabbed the cooler, and then followed Tiffany into their house. Once they were inside, Glee stopped to put the cooler down, but Tiffany kept on walking, and she disappeared down a hallway that led to the kitchen. Then, Glee thought that she heard something fall onto the floor down the hall, so she called out to Tiffany, but Tiffany didn't call back. So Glee walked into the hallway where Tiffany had just been, and when she did, she screamed, turned around, and started running. That night, Dana sat at the dinner table with his girlfriend Monica and her parents at Monica's parents' house. They had just finished a large Easter dinner, and Dana thanked Monica's parents for letting him spend the holiday with them. Then, not long after that, Dana and Monica drove back to their college campus in Dana's car. When they got to Dana's dorm room, he called home, but nobody answered. Dana thought it was odd that they were not picking up because he figured by now his family would be back from the beach, but Monica told him that they might have gone out for Easter dinner, or maybe they had all been worn out from the trip and just went straight to bed. But the following afternoon, Dana called home again after his classes, and there still was not any answer. So Dana called his father's office. And his father's assistant said that Dale had not checked in with her that day, but she thought it was possible that maybe Dale was just taking another day off after Easter. Dana said it seemed really strange to him that his dad had not even called the office to let her know. Dana finally hung up the phone, and then he went to find Monica in her dorm room. And as soon as Monica saw him, she knew something was wrong. Dana was pacing back and forth, and he had a really worried look on his face. Monica asked what was going on, and he told her that he still couldn't get a hold of his parents or his sister. Monica stood up and walked over to him and put her hands on his shoulders and tried to get him to calm down. And she said if he was really worried, he could totally call her dad because he was an FBI agent and he would know what to do. Dana said he really was worried, so Monica did call her father and then handed the phone over to Dana. Dana thanked Monica's dad for talking with him, and then he told him what was going on with his family. And Monica's dad pretty much immediately urged Dana to just stay calm, and then he also told Dana that, he would be happy to look around on his end to see if he could learn anything about what was going on with them. Later that day, Monica's dad would call Dana back, and even though he didn't have much information, what he did know was the Ewell's home security alarm company had not gotten any indication that the alarm had gone off or that anything out of the ordinary had occurred at the house. After hearing this, Dana did feel a bit more relaxed, and Monica would say to him that, probably he just missed his family at the house when he had called. Dana figured she was right, and he told her that he would just try to get a hold of them in the morning if they still had not contacted him by then. The next day at 9 a.m., so this was April 21st, 2 days after Glee and her daughter Tiffany had gotten back to their home in Fresno, the Ewell's housekeeper walked up to their front door, unlocked it with a key that she had, and she went inside. She was surprised that the alarm didn't beep when she walked in. The family was usually gone when she was there, and they almost always set the alarm when they left. So the housekeeper called out for Glee to see if she was home, but nobody responded. Then the housekeeper walked through the foyer into the living room that had high vaulted ceilings, and she got scared. Cushions from the couch were on the floor, and pictures had been pulled off the wall. The housekeeper called out to Glee again, but still nobody responded. And so the housekeeper took a breath and tried to calm her nerves, but when she walked into the hallway that led to the kitchen, she immediately screamed and ran back through the house out the front door, and when she got out there, she just happened to see a man walking towards her, and she began screaming out at him. The man tried to figure out what was going on. He would say that he was the Ewell's neighbor and that their son, Dana, had called him that morning because Dana was worried about his parents. The housekeeper just shook her head, started to cry, and pointed to the Ewell's front door. The neighbor would go inside, and he would see the house was a total mess. Then he too stepped into the hallway, and immediately he ran to the phone and dialed 911. A few minutes after that 911 call, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet morning in the Ewell's wealthy Fresno neighborhood. Lead investigator John Souza of the Fresno County Sheriff's Department parked his car in front of the Ewell's house and stepped outside. It was a warm spring day, about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Souza was short with dark hair and a thick mustache, and it was bright out, so he had his sunglasses on. From behind his glasses, he could see that the police sirens had already attracted a crowd. People up and down the street were now standing on their lawns, just staring over at the Ewell's house, wondering what was going on. Detective Souza saw the Ewell's housekeeper and their neighbor, who had called 911, standing outside. The housekeeper was inconsolable, and the neighbor looked like he was still in shock. So Souza walked up to them and tried to calm them down and told them everything was okay now, and then at some point the neighbor told Souza what he had seen inside of the Ewell's house. Another squad car pulled up, and Deputy Chris Curtis got out. He was young and tall with light brown hair. Souza asked the neighbor and the housekeeper to please wait outside, and he told them that other officers would arrive soon to ask them more questions. Then Souza took off his sunglasses and waved Deputy Curtis over to him, and then the two of them walked into the Ewell's house together. Every room Souza and Curtis walked through inside of the house looked like it had been totally ransacked. Souza had spent his early days in law enforcement in the robbery unit, and he told Curtis that in all his time investigating robberies, he'd never seen a house in this state. It was like whoever had done this had opened and emptied virtually every cabinet and drawer and littered the floor with everything the Ewells owned. Then Souza and Curtis walked down the hall towards the kitchen, and they found the first body. Dale was lying face down, dead in the hallway. A pool of dried blood had formed under his face, and several unopened newspapers were scattered across the floor. Souza thought it looked like rigor mortis had already started to set in on the body. Rigor mortis is when muscles in a body stiffen after death, and so Souza wondered if Dale had been dead for days. Souza and Curtis walked further down the hall, they came to the kitchen, and they stopped again, because on the kitchen floor, they saw Tiffany lying face down like her father. Blood had run across the kitchen floor, and a drink had spilled nearby. Then they went back into the hall, walked into a home office, and found the third body. Glee was lying on her side, and massive amounts of blood had pooled behind her. Not long after Souza and Curtis found Glee, the forensics team arrived and started looking for evidence on and around the bodies. And while they did that, Souza and Curtis searched the rest of the house. The door to the main bedroom was open, and Souza could see that the bedroom looked even more torn apart than the rest of the house. He and Curtis walked into the room and saw that every drawer of a large wooden dresser had been opened, and clothes were all over the floor. Souza walked over to a vanity table and saw an open jewelry box that had been emptied. It seemed clear that whoever had killed the Ewells had also stolen valuable items from this jewelry box. So Souza thought there was a chance this was just a robbery gone wrong, that the Ewells had just come home at the worst time, and when they walked in on the robbers panicked and killed them all. After doing an initial search of the house, Souza and Curtis joined the forensics team near Dale's body. Forensics officers had found Dale's wallet nearby, but it had been cleaned out, and that supported the idea that robbery could have been the motive behind these killings. But then, forensics officers told Souza something that he was not expecting to hear. Based on the wounds on the bodies, they believed the Ewells had been shot with a semi-automatic 9mm pistol. But there was no murder weapon, and not a single bullet casing had been left behind. And they said the weapon used, and the way in which the victims were killed, was like something they had seen in professional hits carried out by drug cartels. They also told Souza that they found small yellow fibers on all three bodies, but they'd have to run tests on these fibers to know what they were. Souza didn't know what to make of any of that. On the surface, nothing about the Ewells led him to believe they were mixed up in drug smuggling or some criminal enterprise, but Souza knew enough not to rule anything out. So, as more members of his investigative team arrived, Souza sent them out to interview the Ewell's neighbors. Then, Souza got word from his boss that Dana Ewell was on his way to the sheriff's station with an FBI agent, and Souza needed to go see them. At around noon, so 3 hours after the bodies had been discovered, Dana sat with his girlfriend Monica and her father, the FBI agent, in a small office in the Fresno County Sheriff's Department. Dana had called his parents' neighbor to ask him to check on the house. After the neighbor found the bodies and called 911, he had called Dana back and told Dana he needed to come home right now. But when Dana asked what was going on, the neighbor just kept saying over and over that he just needed to come home. Right after that, Dana had found Monica, and they called Monica's dad, the FBI agent. Dana said he knew something had to be really wrong, even if the neighbor wouldn't say what it was. And so using his law enforcement contacts, Monica's dad found out what had happened, and he had called ahead to the Fresno Sheriff's Department to let them know that he and Dana would be there soon. Then Dana, Monica, and her dad had flown to Fresno and headed right to the Sheriff's Department. In the office, Monica held Dana's hand tight. Dana hadn't heard all of the details, but he knew his parents and his sister were dead. Detective Souza and Deputy Curtis walked into the office, fresh from the crime scene. Souza told Dana right away how sorry he was about what had happened. In a quiet voice, Dana asked if there was anything he could do to help. And Souza said, well, I know your father was a wealthy businessman. Do you know if maybe he had any enemies in the corporate world? Dana looked up in surprise, and then looked at his girlfriend, and then over at her father, and then he looked up at Souza and said as far as he knew, his dad did not have any enemies. They talked a while longer, and anytime Dana had questions about the investigation process, he would look to Monica's dad for help. Monica's dad and Souza both explained that it could take a while to figure out exactly what had happened. So Dana said he would stay with his uncle, who lived close by, in case the police needed anything else from him. Souza thanked them all for coming in and said he'd be in touch soon. But the following day, Dana would reach out to Souza and he would tell him that he really needed to speak to the police again. And when Souza and Dana met for the second time in that same small office at the sheriff's department, Dana said he had not been completely honest the day before because he did not want to upset his girlfriend or his girlfriend's father. Souza was a little thrown off by this, but he said he understood, and then he asked Dana to tell him anything that might help police in their investigation. Dana told Souza that his father, Dale, did have one enemy that he was aware of, and his name was Frank Lamb, the man who had mentored his father and who had owned the airplane business before handing it over to Dale. Detective Souza thanked Dana for coming back in and for being honest with him. And later that day, Souza discovered that Frank Lamb had not just walked away from his company in the 1970s and sold it to Dale. It turned out Frank had been busted in a federal drug trafficking case, and when he got sent to prison for 3 years, Dale had swooped in and taken the company out from under him. A few days after the murder, Souza and Curtis went to meet Frank at his house. Frank, who was very soft-spoken and polite, quickly welcomed the investigators inside. Frank said he'd read about the deaths of Dale and his family, and regardless of whatever bad blood had existed between them, Frank was sad to hear about what had happened. Souza and Curtis pressed Frank about his connection to known drug smugglers that had landed him in prison back in the 1970s. Frank said he had no connection to any drug runners and that he had nothing to do with Dale's murder. Then he smiled at Souza and said, Dale was very selfish and a very hard guy to work with, so I wouldn't be surprised if Dale had made a lot of people angry over his career. Souza and Curtis left Frank's house with not much more to go on than what they had arrived with. Souza didn't necessarily trust Frank, but the idea that Frank had waited 20 years to exact some kind of revenge on Dale didn't seem right to Souza. Still, there were details at the crime scene that made it look like the murders could have been carried out by a hitman from a drug cartel. So Souza didn't want to totally dismiss Frank as a suspect. But later that week, Souza and Curtis made a discovery that seemed even more bizarre than the idea that the Ewells were connected to a drug smuggling operation. They found out that Glee had once worked for the CIA. Souza reached out to the CIA, but the CIA was not forthcoming with many details. All Souza learned was that Glee had been a Spanish translator in South America for the CIA over 30 years earlier. So all of a sudden, Souza and his team wondered if Glee had been the target, and if the murders were somehow retribution for something she'd been involved in during her time in the agency. And that information about Glee's past somehow got out, and the media jumped all over it. Pretty soon, there were tabloid-style stories about the murdered millionaires with possible connections to international drug cartels and the CIA. With all this media attention, the spotlight got even brighter on the Fresno Sheriff's Department, and Dana and other members of the Ewell family and some friends started to publicly question if Souza and his team were really up to the task here. Dana got so frustrated with the lack of progress and the crazy rumors swirling around about his family that he publicly compared Souza and Curtis to Bert and Ernie from Sesame Street, the kids show. Dana thought these two would never find the person who had killed his parents and his sister. Souza and his team tried to block out the noise and just stay focused on their investigation. And as they continued to turn over all the evidence in front of them, they realized that despite the possible links to drug cartels and the CIA, Souza came to believe that the case might be a lot simpler than that. The Ewells were rich, and their house had been ransacked. But all the families in their neighborhood were rich too, and no other homes had been hit. So Souza wanted to focus on people who would have known how wealthy the Ewells were and who had a direct connection to them. But when Souza and his team shifted their investigation in this direction, it became clear that anyone who went to school with Dana would have known about his family's money. Because not only did Dana walk around campus in expensive Armani suits, but his college newspaper had also done a story about him. And in that story, Dana had talked a lot about the success of his father's business and his family's wealth. So Souza and his team reached out to some of Dana's friends at Santa Clara University, and a few of them said there was one person who police really needed to talk to, a recent graduate named Joel Radovich. They all said Joel was a loner and kind of a strange guy, and that he had always seemed a little obsessed with Dana. On May 8th, almost 3 weeks after the murders, Souza drove 2.5 hours from Fresno to Santa Clara to meet Joel Radovich. And when Souza had talked to Joel on the phone to arrange this meeting, he just got an odd feeling about him. Joel said he did not want police to come to his mother's house, so he would go to the motel where Souza was going to be staying. But that wasn't really what had grabbed Souza's attention. Before Souza had hung up, Joel asked him if he was going to be arrested. Souza had told Joel that, "No, I really just want to talk to you," but Souza did think it was very odd that someone would jump to the conclusion that they were being arrested right off the bat. Outside the motel, Souza saw Joel pull into the parking lot in his black Honda CRX car. Joel got out of the car and began walking over to Souza. Joel was 22 years old with bleached blonde hair. He wore a baggy long-sleeve shirt and baggy jeans. Souza introduced himself and then led Joel to a small motel room, and then they both sat down at a table that was pushed up against the wall. And before Souza could even ask a question, Joel asked again if he was going to be arrested. A look of surprise came across Souza's face, and he asked why Joel was so worried about that. Joel said that he'd actually been arrested years earlier for stealing furniture from a dorm at Santa Clara University. And since then, he said the Santa Clara police were always harassing him. Souza told Joel that he didn't have anything to do with the Santa Clara police or the stolen furniture. But Souza made a note that Joel had just admitted to having committed a robbery in the past. Souza asked Joel how he knew Dana. Joel said they had met in the dorm and hung out a few times, but that was really it. Joel was a couple of years ahead of Dana in college, so they weren't really close, and Joel said he had not kept in touch with Dana, or really anybody from school, since he had graduated a year earlier. Then Souza asked Joel where he had been on Easter Sunday. Joel immediately looked up at the ceiling like he was trying to remember something, and then he looked down and he said that he'd actually been at a paint and body shop getting some work done on his car. After chatting for a bit longer, Souza finally smiled and thanked Joel for driving all this way out to the motel to meet him, and then Joel got up and walked out of the motel. But right after Joel was gone, Souza got in touch with members of his team. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he thought Joel was hiding something. He wasn't sure the kid was a killer, but he was almost positive Joel knew more than he was saying. So Souza wanted to learn as much about him as he could. It would take months for the sheriff's department to get everything in place, but eventually they got clearance to conduct full-time surveillance on Joel. And what police learned from that surveillance operation and from digging deeper into Joel's life convinced Souza the investigation was on the right track. But Souza's process was methodical and slow, and months went by without any new information getting out to the public. So Dana and other people on the outside thought the cops just weren't doing anything. And as the investigation stretched into months and then years, even Monica's dad, the FBI agent, questioned the Fresno Sheriff's Department's techniques. But Souza, Curtis, and the rest of the team just kept blocking out the public attacks. They were confident they had the killer in their sights, but they wanted to make sure their case was airtight before they moved in. In early March of 1995, almost 3 years after the murders, Souza, Curtis, and local police officers approached a TGI Fridays restaurant in a town just outside of Los Angeles. Souza went around back to where he had a car waiting, and Curtis and the others headed inside. The music was loud inside and the place was packed, and Curtis was surprised this was where the investigation had finally led. But he and Souza were sure that the bartender working at Fridays that night was the one person who could bring the Ewell murder case to a close. Curtis weaved around a few tables and moved out of the way of the server, but he never took his eyes off the bartender. And the bartender eventually looked up and saw Curtis coming his way. The bartender immediately began scanning around the room like he was looking for his exit, but he could tell there was just no way he could make a run for it. So Curtis and the other cops walked up to the bartender and told him they needed to talk. The bartender got a look on his face like he knew he'd been caught. Then police led him out through the kitchen to a parking lot behind the restaurant, and they put him in the car where Souza was waiting for him. And when Souza was done talking to this bartender, police would finally know who had killed Dale, Glee, and Tiffany, and how they had done it. Based on information provided by the bartender, evidence found at the murder scene, and details from interviews carried out during the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened the day someone murdered the Ewell family on April 19, 1992. On the night of April 18th, so the day before the murders, the killer watched steam rise from their shower. While the hot water ran, the killer stepped into the shower and covered their body in shaving cream. Then they reached down with their right hand, grabbed a disposable razor from the side of the shower, and ran the blade over the hair on their left forearm. A few minutes later, they rinsed the razor off under the hot water, they bent down, and started shaving the hair on their left leg. The process took a long time, but eventually the killer had removed all of their body hair except for their eyebrows and the hair on their head. After they were done, they stepped out of the shower and dried off. Before sunrise on April 19th, the following morning, the killer got dressed in all black, wore a knit hat to cover the hair on their head, and slipped on a pair of latex gloves. The killer walked outside and put a large backpack as well as an unloaded semi-automatic 9mm gun in the back seat of the car. Then the killer drove to the Ewell's neighborhood. When they arrived, they drove past the Ewell's house and parked their car a few blocks away. They grabbed the backpack and the gun, got out of the car, closed the door, and moved quickly through the darkness to the Ewell's house. Once the killer got there, they walked around to the backyard that was surrounded by a low cinder block fence. They dropped their bag and the gun into the backyard and then climbed over the fence, they grabbed their things, and then ran to a small shed in the backyard and stepped inside. The killer had studied everything about the house, and they knew there was a spare key on the floor of the shed. So they pulled a flashlight out of their bag, they found the key, they grabbed it, and then darted across the yard towards the back door. The killer unlocked the door and walked inside. The house was dark, but the killer found their way to Dale and Glee's bedroom. They turned on the light, opened their backpack, and pulled out a large plastic sheet and unrolled the sheet across the floor. Then the killer put their gun down on the plastic sheet, they walked across the room to a jewelry box, they emptied it and put the stolen jewelry in their backpack. The killer then sat down on the plastic sheet. They reached into their backpack again and pulled out ammunition as well as a homemade silencer made with PVC pipe and several tennis balls that had been cut in half. The killer loaded their gun and attached the homemade silencer to it. Then they sat there on the plastic sheet and waited patiently for someone to come home. Several hours later, at about 5 p.m., the killer heard the garage door open. The killer felt butterflies in their stomach and a jolt of nervous energy. They grabbed their gun, they ran down the hall, and crouched down in a room that was across from the kitchen. The killer could hear a door open and then also Glee and Tiffany talking. The killer tried to control their breath and told themselves to stay calm and just wait for the right moment. Then, Tiffany walked past the killer in the hall and went into the kitchen. The killer immediately sprung up from their hiding spot, walked down the hall after her, and then pointed the gun into the kitchen and fired. The bullet hit Tiffany in the back of the head. Tiffany's drink flew from her hand, blood splashed onto the walls and floor, and she fell face down. Tiffany had died almost instantly. The killer heard Glee say something from another room, so they spun around in the hall. Then Glee came around the corner and saw the killer. Glee screamed, she turned, and started to run away, but the killer fired off 3 shots in her direction, and Glee stumbled into the office nearby. The killer ran down the hall to the office and saw Glee lying on her side and bleeding, but she was still breathing, so the killer aimed and shot Glee just below the eye. The killer was breathing fast now. They walked away from Glee's body and went to hide in the room near the kitchen, where they tried to calm down and got ready to wait some more. About 30 minutes later, the killer heard the garage door open again. The sound of the door had made them tense up, and so they stood and raised their gun and got ready for the next killing. The killer heard Dale walk into the house, and then when Dale walked down that hallway right past the killer stepped out of their hiding place, raised their gun, and shot Dale in the back of the neck. Dale immediately crumpled to the floor, and newspapers he'd picked up from the front yard scattered all around him. Dale died in the hallway before ever seeing the bodies of his wife and daughter. The killer walked forward, kneeled down, and got a close look at Dale to make sure he really was dead. Satisfied, the killer grabbed Dale's wallet out of his pants pocket, slipped Dale's cash and credit cards into their own pockets, and then dropped the wallet back on the floor. Then the killer rushed through the house, emptying drawers and cabinets, knocking stuff off of tables, and trying to make the scene look like a random burglary as much as possible. Then the killer ran to the main bedroom, rolled up their plastic sheet, and put it in their backpack. Then they walked out of the house through the backyard, put the key back where they had found it in the shed, and climbed over the fence away from the property. The killer did their best to move fast through the neighborhood without drawing any attention to themselves. They made it back to their car, they hopped in, and they sped away. A few minutes later, they pulled onto the highway and left Fresno behind. When they finally made it home, they sat down in their bed and waited for the phone to ring, because they knew Dana Ewell would be in touch soon. Joel Radovich, the young man Sousa had never trusted, murdered Dale, Glee, and Tiffany. But Joel had carried these murders out at Dana Ewell's request. It would turn out that despite what Joel had told Sousa, he and Dana were close friends. In fact, some people said they were almost inseparable. And according to some of their classmates, Dana and Joel seemed to lack any sense of morality. They had convinced themselves there was no difference between right and wrong, and so any action, even murder, could be justified. And Dana wanted to murder his parents and his sister because with all of them gone, he would inherit $8 million and his father's company. Dana didn't just want to follow in his father's footsteps, he wanted to replace his father. In fact, in the story Dana's college newspaper had written about him, Dana claimed to be the brains behind his father's successful airplane business, and he even implied he was running the company while going to college. So Dana had offered Joel $4 million of the inheritance he was sure to get if Joel would kill his family. Dana had given Joel a layout of the house and said he would leave a key in the shed for him and told him how to disable the alarm system. Joel had accepted the deal. Then he bought a book called Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors, to help him plan the perfect murders. The book had led Joel to shave off all of his body hair so he wouldn't leave any hair behind at the crime scene, which could then be used as DNA evidence. And the book suggested using a gun and a homemade silencer that could not be traced back to the shooter. But Joel needed help with that part of the plan, so he had turned to his good friend, the TGI Fridays bartender, who was an avid gun collector. The bartender had given Joel a semi-automatic 9mm, and he had helped Joel build the silencer. The tennis balls used in the silencer had left these strange yellow fibers on all the bodies. Then, after the murders, the bartender got the gun back, broke it apart, and buried the pieces in different places. And while that was all happening, Dana Ewell had called his father's office, and he had talked to his girlfriend's FBI agent father, all to throw off suspicion and to make people believe he, the son, was truly worried about his family and wanted justice for them. And Dana's tactics had worked for a little while, because it turned out that Sousa was almost positive Joel Radovich had murdered the Ewells not long after they had met in the motel. But it took some serious digging before the investigators became convinced that Dana Ewell was the person behind his family's murder. And putting all the pieces together and getting an airtight case against Dana took a long time. But finally, surveillance on Joel had led police to the TGI Fridays bartender, and after they cornered him at work, the bartender told police he knew everything about the murders and he admitted his part in them. Then he led police to the place where he had buried the barrel of the gun that was used in the murders, and he agreed to testify against Joel and Dana in court. The bartender was ultimately granted immunity for his testimony, and as of 2023, he works as an attorney in California. As for Joel and Dana, they were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Dale, Glee, and Tiffany are all buried next to each other in Fresno. The epitaph on all three of their headstones reads, "Together Forever." Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are not available on this podcast. They are only on YouTube. Again, that channel is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On December 13th, 2001, 35-year-old Tracy Roberts was upstairs in her house in the rural town of Early, Iowa, running a bath for her baby daughter. And as the water began to fill the tub, Tracy heard the front door open downstairs. Tracy assumed it had to be her husband getting home early from a trip, so she scooped the baby up and headed into the hall and over to the top of the stairs to call down to him and say hello. But when she got to the top of the stairs and looked down to the first floor, it was not her husband who had just come in the house. Instead, it was two people who she didn't recognize, and the moment she saw them, they looked up at her and began charging up the stairs after her. Within minutes, 2 guns would be fired, and at least one person would be dead. But the mystery of what actually happened that night and why would take nearly a decade to solve. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the Amazon Music follow button over for a nice spaghetti dinner, but make them eat it with a spoon. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of December 13th, 2001, 35-year-old Tracy Roberts was making tea in the kitchen of her beautiful 2-story Victorian-style house in the rural town of Early, Iowa. Tracy's husband, Michael, had been out of town on business for a week, so Tracy had been on her own, taking care of her 3 kids, and she felt like she'd barely had a moment to breathe. But now, her 11-year-old son was at school, and her 3-year-old son and baby daughter were both napping, so she finally had a minute to herself. The teapot whistled, so Tracy grabbed a tea bag, put it in her cup, and poured in the hot water. Then she poured in some milk, grabbed a spoon to stir it with, and sat down at the kitchen table. But before she could even take a sip, there was a knock at the door. Tracy shouted, "Come in," and then got up from the table. Tracy had spent most of her life in Chicago, Illinois, and moving from a huge city like Chicago to Early, Iowa, a town of 500 people where no one even locked their doors, had taken her a while to get used to. But after 3 years of living in Early, she'd really started to love the peace and security that came with it. Tracy walked through a large living room with hardwood floors, and when she arrived at her front door, she saw a 20-year-old man named Dustin Wade standing there. Dustin was 5 foot 7 inches tall and skinny, and he was wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and a brown leather jacket. Tracy said hello, and Dustin smiled. Tracy was tall with blue eyes and long brown hair, and from the moment she'd moved to Early, people in town talked about how beautiful she was. Tracy asked Dustin if everything was okay, and he said he'd come by the house because Tracy's husband, Michael, said he had some work for Dustin to do. Michael was an Australian businessman who had started his own computer security company when he moved to the US after marrying Tracy. And a year earlier, he had hired Dustin's mom to work part-time as an office manager for him. And when Michael had met Dustin, he'd taken to the shy young man almost immediately. And so Michael had started paying Dustin to do small jobs for his company like filing and making copies. Dustin had struggled in school throughout his childhood, and even when he got older, he had trouble making friends. Doctors had diagnosed him with attention deficit disorder and said he had learning disabilities that could be the cause of his shyness. But Dustin had really started to come out of his shell when he started working for Michael and spending time with him and Tracy. Michael and Tracy had even taken Dustin paintballing with them, and it was pretty much all Dustin talked about now. Back at the front door, Tracy told Dustin that there must have been a mix-up because Michael was still out of town, and so she told Dustin to just come back the following day to see what Michael needed him to work on. Dustin thanked Tracy and then walked back outside. Tracy closed the door and then went into the kitchen and sat down to drink her tea. But just a few minutes later, there was another knock at the front door, and so Tracy figured it had to be Dustin wanting to ask her something else. And so she took a deep breath, a little annoyed she couldn't relax with her tea, and shouted, "Come in," and then headed back to the door. But it wasn't Dustin standing there this time. It was one of Tracy's friends who'd come by to drop off some Christmas cookies she'd baked for Tracy and the kids. Tracy hugged her friend and asked if she wanted to come in for a cup of tea. Since moving to Iowa, there were only a handful of people that Tracy felt like she could really talk to, and this friend was one of those people. And right now, Tracy desperately wanted to talk to this friend about what was going on in her life. Her friend said she'd love to come in for some tea, and so the two of them walked back to the kitchen. The friend sat down, and Tracy poured her a cup, and then she sat down as well. Then Tracy told her friend that she wanted to tell her a secret, something she hadn't even really told her husband. Immediately, a concerned look came across her friend's face, but Tracy didn't seem to pay attention to that. Instead, Tracy took a sip of her tea and then looked around the kitchen cautiously, like she thought someone could be listening. And then, after feeling satisfied, Tracy looked at her friend and she told her that she was scared her ex-husband might try to hurt her. Her friend's eyes went wide. She knew Tracy had been married to a doctor before she was married to Michael, but she had never heard Tracy talk much about her ex-husband. Tracy took another sip of tea. Then she told her friend that her ex-husband had filed with the courts to try to get sole custody of their son, Tracy's 11-year-old. The boy was her only child with her first husband, and she said she had tried to keep things as civil as possible during the divorce for her son's sake. But now her ex-husband was living in Virginia, and he wanted their son to leave Tracy and go live with him. As she said this, Tracy's hands began to tremble, and her spoon rattled against the side of her teacup. And then Tracy said there was no way she would ever let her son go live with his dad halfway across the country. And then, with a trembling voice, Tracy said her ex-husband was a bully, and she really worried that he might do something to try to hurt her. Tracy's friend felt so bad for Tracy, and so she got up, she walked around the table, and gave Tracy a hug. And the two women would stay in the kitchen a little longer, and they would continue to talk both about the ex-husband and just about life. But eventually, Tracy's friend had to head home, and Tracy had to check on the kids. By around 6:30 p.m. that night, Tracy had managed to push basically any thoughts about her ex-husband out of her head. and now she was focusing on the bedtime routine for her kids. And so she asked her 11-year-old to keep his little brother company while she gave the baby a bath. The two boys ran upstairs to the 11-year-old's room to watch a movie. Tracy turned off the lights downstairs to save on the electric bill, and then she carried the baby upstairs to the bathroom. Tracy started running the water, but before she was about to start giving the baby a bath, she heard the front door open downstairs, and then footsteps began to move around inside the entryway. Tracy figured Michael must have gotten home earlier than expected, so she lifted the baby up and she walked down the hall to the top of the stairs, but Michael wasn't in the entryway. Instead, two men in dark clothes were standing there looking up at her, and immediately Tracy screamed. Tracy heard the two men rush across the entryway towards the stairs, and she felt like she could barely breathe. The first floor of the house was pitch black, so she couldn't really see who the men were, but she knew they were there to hurt her and her kids. So Tracy clutched the baby close to her chest, and she yelled for her oldest son. Then she ran down the hall towards the boy's bedroom and got there just as the 11-year-old opened the door. The boy was confused and scared by his mother's screams, but Tracy didn't have time to explain. She could hear the footsteps of the men on the stairs. So she handed the baby to her son, told him to go back into the room, lock the door, and protect his brother and sister at all costs. The boy was about to cry, but he took his baby sister in his arms. He went back into his room, slammed the door shut, and locked it just as his mom said to do. Then Tracy turned around and began walking down the hallway in the direction of the stairs where these two men were originally running up. And as she walked down the hall, suddenly she felt a pair of nylon pantyhose wrap around her throat from behind, and one of these men yanked her towards him and started strangling her. Tracy was choking and kicking and trying to get free, but the pantyhose kept getting tighter and tighter around her neck. Finally, Tracy used all of her strength to launch herself forward. She broke free from this chokehold and stumbled down the hall, and her attacker fell back and lost his footing. Then Tracy ran to her bedroom at the end of the hall near the top of the stairs, and then once she went inside, she ran to the back corner of the room next to the bed, dropped down onto her knees in front of a small gun safe she and Michael kept on the floor. In the dark, Tracy punched in the code for the safe, she opened up the door and grabbed 2 revolvers from inside. And just then, she felt one of the intruders grab her legs, and she fell flat on the floor. Tracy screamed, and without thinking, she turned and pointed one of the revolvers behind her and fired off multiple shots. The gunfire flashed in the dark and smoke began to fill the room. She heard the man who was holding her legs start to groan in pain and crumple onto the floor. And she heard the other man run out of the room, down the stairs, and out the front door. Tracy struggled to breathe and her throat felt like it was burning, but she pulled herself to her feet, and in the dark, she could make out the shadow of the man she'd just shot. He looked like he was face down on the ground. But then the man groaned and started to stand up, so Tracy screamed again and fired the other revolver, and this time the attacker fell back onto the floor, motionless. Tracy stood in the dark bedroom, wheezing and fighting back tears. Then she called out for her 11-year-old son again. Down the hall, the boy opened his bedroom door and rushed out of his room, still holding the baby and with his little brother at his side. The children came into their mother's bedroom. Tracy put down the guns, she took the baby in her arms, and they all stood there in the dark for a minute next to this guy she had just shot. Then they all went downstairs, turned on the lights, and Tracy's oldest son went to the kitchen and dialed 911. Around 7:15 p.m., a few minutes after the 911 call was placed, Deputy Daniel Brusher of the Sac County Sheriff's Office was driving in his cruiser outside of Early, Iowa, when he got an urgent call from the dispatcher. She said there'd been a shooting in Early, but the caller had been a young boy, and she couldn't get that many details. All she knew was that 2 men had attacked the boy's mother, and the mother had managed to shoot one of the attackers. Deputy Brusher said he was on his way and told her to make sure if the ambulance got there before him that nobody went inside until police had cleared the area, because for all he knew, there might still be a shooter inside of the house. Then Brusher flipped on his sirens, hit the gas, and sped down a country road toward Tracy's house. On his way, he called for backup from the sheriff's department, local Early police, and the state police. And about 10 minutes later, he arrived outside the beautiful Victorian-style home, turned off the sirens, and parked his car on the driveway behind an old white sedan. An ambulance was parked nearby, but the EMTs had heeded his warning and had not gone inside yet. Deputy Brusher took a deep breath. This type of call was not something he was used to. Break-ins and shootings just did not happen in Early. So he was nervous. But he knew at least one child, the boy who had called 911, was inside the house, so he needed to act fast and get the child to safety. Brusher stepped out of his car and felt the cold winter air against his face. He steadied himself, drew his gun, and crept towards the house. He could feel his heart beating fast, but he tried to stay calm and focused. Then, as he was approaching, he saw the front door of the house open, and he tightened his grip on his weapon. But a stunned look came across his face when he saw Tracy and her 3 kids calmly walk out of the house. Brusher yelled at Tracy for her and the kids to get behind him as fast as they could, but Tracy said the house was safe now. Brusher was obviously reassured to hear that, but he still yelled for her to get away from the door. So Tracy did as she was told, and she walked with the kids towards the deputy, and he rushed over to meet them. He saw right away there was a red bruise across Tracy's throat, but at least at first glance, she seemed okay and the kids seemed to be unharmed. Then Tracy looked at Brusher and told him that one of the men who attacked her had run off, and the other one was dead in an upstairs bedroom because she said she had killed him. Brusher told her to stay there and then signaled for the EMTs to come over and look at Tracy's injury as well as the kids. Then Brusher walked up to the front door of the house. He still wasn't sure what was going on inside, so he kept his weapon drawn and he moved carefully and slowly. Once he was inside, he made his way up the stairs, and when he reached the hall, he could smell gunpowder in the air. And as he got closer to Tracy's bedroom, the smell got stronger. Brusher stepped into her bedroom and flipped on the light. And on the ground, he saw a man lying on his chest with his face slightly turned out. There was a wide pool of blood that surrounded the body, and it looked like it was starting to seep into the cracks of the hardwood floors. Brusher crossed the room to the body and crouched down beside it, and after feeling for a pulse and not finding one, he noticed there was a wallet in the back pocket of the dead man's jeans. So Brusher grabbed the wallet and pulled out a driver's license. He looked at the photo on the license and then held it up next to the man's face. And clearly, the license belonged to the dead man. The dead man's name was Dustin Wade, the same Dustin Wade who had been working for Tracy's husband. The scene in the bedroom totally shocked Deputy Brusher. The amount of blood on the floor and the multiple bullet wounds on the body were beyond anything he'd seen before. But he shook it off because he had work to do. There had been 2 intruders in the house, and now the other one was presumably on the run somewhere in town. Brusher contacted all levels of law enforcement in the area and let them know that one of Tracy's attackers had fled the scene and was likely in the area, but he had no physical description of the suspect. Then Brusher walked out of the bedroom, headed downstairs, and stepped outside. He walked over to one of the EMTs on the scene and asked if the kids were okay, and the EMT said none of them had been injured, at which point Brusher let out a sigh of relief. Members of the medical team were still looking over the wound on Tracy's throat, but during their medical exam, she was still able to give Brusher a more detailed account of what had happened. But when Tracy said she was still having trouble breathing, the EMTs said they needed to get her to the hospital to make sure she hadn't suffered any internal damage when she was being strangled. So Brusher told Tracy once she was feeling up to it, the police would follow up with her. Tracy thanked him, and then she and the kids got into an ambulance and headed to the hospital. At this point, members of multiple law enforcement agencies were arriving on the scene, and forensics and ballistics headed inside and got to work assessing the evidence in the upstairs bedroom where Dustin had been shot and killed. And while they did that, Brusher and officers from the sheriff's department walked the grounds to see if there were any clues that might lead them to the second attacker. But while they were searching, Brusher heard a car suddenly come screeching to a halt in front of the house. A short woman in her 40s stepped out of the car. It was Dustin's mother. She was shaking and she had a frantic look on her face, and she began yelling, "Is my son here? Is Dustin here?" Brusher walked over to Dustin's mother and tried to calm her down. He had hoped they'd have more time before word spread, but in a town that small, it was impossible to keep something like this secret for very long. Then Dustin's mother pointed at the old white sedan in the driveway. She said it was Dustin's car and she needed to know if he was there. Brusher nodded, but the look in his eyes gave something away, because immediately Dustin's mother asked if her son was dead. And in a soft voice, Brusher said, yes. Dustin's mother started sobbing and wailing, and her head fell on Brusher's shoulder, and through tears, she asked if she could go inside and hold him. Brusher felt sick. No matter what had happened in that bedroom, he couldn't imagine the pain this mother was going through right now. He put his hands on her shoulders and told her he was so sorry, but she could not go inside. Then he helped her back to her car and told her that the best thing she could do right now was just go home and he would come talk to her as soon as he could. As Brusher was speaking to Dustin's mother, one of the local early police officers who knew Dustin's mother came over to talk to her as well, and after a few minutes, they had convinced her to head back home. Watching the devastated mother drive off into the night made Brusher feel like he'd stepped into another world. How could something like this have happened? Why would a young man like Dustin attack a woman in her home while she was there with her 3 young kids? Brusher hoped he could find some answers in Dustin's car, so he walked over to the white sedan. The driver's side door was unlocked, and when they opened it and looked inside, Brusher saw a pink spiral notebook in the passenger seat. He reached across the car, grabbed the notebook, opened it, and started reading, and a look of complete shock came across his face. The handwriting was sloppy, but Brusher could still make out what was written on the first page. Dustin had written out a confession saying he was going to go kill Tracy, but the attack wasn't personal. Instead, Dustin had written that he was going to murder Tracy because her ex-husband had paid him to do it. In the days following the attack, Brusher and other members of the investigative team returned to Tracy's house multiple times. They still had no information on the second attacker, and so they were desperate to find any new evidence that might point them in the direction of this second person. And when Tracy came home from the hospital, she tried to give police as many details as she could about what had happened, including trying to describe this second person, but it had been dark downstairs and dark in her bedroom, and everything had happened so fast that all she could say about the second attacker was that she thought he was maybe average height and had brown hair. That description wasn't much for police to go on, so Brusher asked Tracy about her relationship with her ex-husband. And as soon as the ex-husband came up, Tracy's entire demeanor changed. She told police about their ongoing ugly custody battle, and she said when they were married, he used to get violent with her and their son. And so after interviewing Tracy, Brusher felt like that pink notebook with the confession by Dustin was the piece of evidence that could break the entire case open, because there was direct reference to Tracy's ex-husband having set up the attempted murder, and now hearing from Tracy about this custody battle, Brusher felt like that could be the ex-husband's motive for wanting to kill Tracy. But before going after Tracy's ex-husband, who lived halfway across the country, Brusher had to make sure Dustin had really written the words in the pink notebook. So on December 18th, 5 days after the attack on Tracy, Brusher and other members of the investigative team headed to Dustin's house. They were greeted at the door and led inside by Dustin's very upset mother. The house was cold and dark. Brusher saw Dustin's father sitting in a chair, motionless and staring at the floor, and Dustin's 2 younger sisters were sitting on the couch, and it was obvious they'd been crying. Brusher apologized for bothering the family, but he said he needed their help figuring out if a note he had found was actually in Dustin's handwriting. Dustin's mother said she could help, and so she led Brusher and the others through the first floor of the house to a door that led to the basement. Then she opened that door, flipped on the light, and they began walking down a creaking staircase. And on the walk down, Brusher was thinking he had no idea what he was about to find. He wondered if Dustin had laid out plans for the attack that they would find, or if maybe Dustin had covered his walls with photos of Tracy. But when they stepped into the basement, Brusher saw that Dustin had converted it into a bedroom that any typical 20-year-old guy might have. Stacks of video games were on the floor in front of a TV, clothes were piled up in different spots, and there were a few books and video game magazines laying next to a computer. Dustin's mother looked around the room and stopped herself from crying in front of the officers. Then she crouched down and dug through a stack of papers and found a couple of pages that were filled with writing Dustin had done in high school, and she handed it to Brusher. He thanked her and then told her some of the other officers needed to check Dustin's computer to see if they could find out anything more about this home invasion, and she said she understood. And then, with just one glance at Dustin's school papers, it was obvious to Brusher that the handwriting matched the handwriting in the pink notebook where Dustin had claimed Tracy's ex-husband had hired him to kill Tracy. So the pink notebook looked like it was going to lead right to the man behind the attack, Tracy's ex-husband, and police hoped that would then lead them to the second attacker who had gotten away. But because Tracy's ex-husband lived in Virginia, investigating him was going to take some work. So law enforcement in Iowa coordinated with local and state agencies in Virginia to conduct a thorough investigation into Tracy's ex-husband that included interviews and searches of his computer and phone data, correspondence, and financial transactions. But nothing they found showed any connection between Tracy's ex-husband and Dustin, and searches of Dustin's computer and phone records didn't reveal any connection either. So no matter how investigators looked at it, there really was no evidence other than the entry in the pink notebook that suggested Dustin and Tracy's ex-husband even knew each other. And by the time the initial investigation into Tracy's ex-husband concluded, Brusher had been on the case for over a month, and he felt like he'd already hit a dead end. Police still had no legitimate lead on the second attacker, and their hopes that Tracy's ex would prove to be the man who had arranged everything had kind of fallen apart. But despite all that, nobody, including Brusher, believed that Dustin had planned the home invasion and Tracy's attempted murder on his own. They just didn't think he had the intellect or the personality to do something like that. So they needed to find out who had gotten Dustin involved and set this attack in motion. And then, in late January of 2002, about a month after Dustin died, the investigators had a simple thought. What if they were focusing on the wrong husband? Instead of Tracy's ex, what if they needed to look more closely at the person she was currently married to, the Australian businessman Michael Roberts? Right after the attack on Tracy, her husband Michael had been considered a suspect because when something like this happens, spouses are almost always suspects. But the discovery of the pink notebook had quickly shifted the investigation's focus to Tracy's ex-husband, and so Michael had not been a priority in late December of 2001 or in January of 2002. But now, with the investigation into Tracy's ex-husband going nowhere, investigators started digging deeper into Michael's background, and they found a lot of red flags. It turned out that Michael and Tracy had met through an online dating site when Michael was still living in Australia. And just 18 days after they had met, Tracy had flown to Australia and they had gotten married. And soon after the wedding, Michael had moved to the United States to be with Tracy, and they had moved to early Iowa together, where Michael set up his computer security business. And it was Michael's company and financial situation that really jumped out at Brusher. Because despite Michael's claims that he was this wealthy international businessman, investigators discovered that his computer security company was actually failing and Michael was facing possible financial ruin. But it looked to police like Michael had a very morbid way out of his financial mess. If Tracy died, he would receive over $1 million from her life insurance policy. With this new information, Brusher contacted Michael and said he wanted Michael to come down to the sheriff's station and take a polygraph test, which is more commonly known as a lie detector test. Michael was not sure if he wanted to subject himself to that, but Brusher told him it would help police eliminate him as a suspect. So, on February 13, 2002, 2 months after the attack on Tracy, Michael arrived at the sheriff's station. It was cold outside, but the second Michael stepped inside, he started sweating. Brusher met Michael, thanked him for coming, and then led him down a bright hallway into a small interrogation room where 2 men were waiting, a state police investigator and the polygraph examiner. The investigator got up and led Michael to a chair at a wooden table, and once Michael was seated, the polygraph examiner approached him and ran a Velcro strap across Michael's chest and then another one across his stomach. These were steps in setting up the polygraph test. And as he was getting set up, Michael continued to sweat profusely, but smiled politely at the examiner. Then the examiner wrapped a blood pressure cuff around Michael's right upper arm and connected 2 small metal finger plates to his index and ring fingers on his left hand. The examiner explained that all of these tools were used to monitor Michael's blood pressure, breathing, and sweat gland activity. Michael gave out a little laugh when the examiner brought up the sweat gland activity because Michael at this point was basically drenched in sweat. The examiner went to a separate table to monitor the test results on his computer, and then at this point, the investigator sat down across from Michael. The investigator smiled and then, in a friendly voice, reminded Michael to just answer the questions truthfully to the best of his knowledge. They checked to make sure the polygraph machine was working, and then the investigator launched into a series of questions about the night Tracy was attacked. He asked Michael about his relationship with his wife, his relationship with the dead man Dustin, and about his work and financial situation. The investigator's voice remained calm and steady throughout the questioning, but Michael struggled with some of the questions about the night of the attack, like he couldn't think straight. And as the test went on, Michael began acting more and more uncomfortable, and the sweat kept pouring down his face. Finally, the investigator smiled again and thanked Michael for his help, and the examiner walked over to Michael and removed the straps, the blood pressure cuff, and the finger plates. Then they told Michael his test was over and he was free to go, and Brusher met him outside of the room and walked him back through the sheriff's station. And as they walked through the station, it was like all of the tension that had been building up during the polygraph suddenly spilled out. Michael, who now had an angry look on his face, said to Brusher that he couldn't believe the police were wasting their time on him, that he loved his wife, and they needed to find the second attacker before anything else happened. But after Michael had stormed out to his car, the polygraph examiner began going over the results of the test, and while the examiner knew that polygraph tests could not be considered 100% accurate, there still was a very strong indication from Michael's test that he had lied multiple times when responding to questions about the night of the attack. And so for now, police considered Michael their primary suspect for being the person behind getting Dustin to try to murder Tracy. The money Michael would receive from the life insurance policy if Tracy died was a clear motive. He had a good relationship with Dustin, and he knew enough about Tracy's custody battle to try to make it look like Tracy's ex-husband was the one behind everything. Later that day, Michael got home and he was furious that the investigation had turned its sights onto him. And Tracy was just as angry. She didn't believe Michael had anything to do with the attack, and she thought the police were desperate to make up for the fact that after 2 months they still had no leads on this second attacker. And so she told Michael that she was afraid the second attacker could show up at the house anytime to try to kill her and finish the job Dustin had failed to do. But over the next few months, the police still had not made progress in finding the second person who'd gone into Tracy's house. And while Michael remained a suspect, they hadn't found any evidence that could prove he had hired Dustin to try to kill his wife. So as the police struggled to move the investigation forward, Tracy came up with a plan to try to force them to work harder and faster to find this second attacker. She decided to take her story to the public in the hope that that would put added pressure on investigators. So in October of 2002, 10 months after the attack, Tracy and Michael appeared on The Montel Williams Show, a popular daytime TV talk show that aired all across the country. On the show, Tracy told her story about the night Dustin and this other person had broken into her house and how she had fought them off and managed to kill Dustin in self-defense while her 11-year-old boy protected his little brother and sister. And then before the interview ended, Michael spoke, and he said one of the main reasons they came on the show was because the second attacker was still out there, and that attacker posed a big threat to their family and the entire community in early Iowa. And Michael urged anyone who had any information to come forward, and he pressed the authorities to keep working to find this second attacker and bring them to justice. After appearing on this show, there was a media frenzy in early Iowa. Newspapers and TV channels all wanted to talk to Tracy and their family and hear the story again for their listeners. And this is exactly what Tracy and her family had hoped for. But it didn't actually bring investigators any closer to finding the second attacker, because no one came forward with any more information. And so really, the constant media attention just started to tear both families at the center of this story apart, Tracy's family and Dustin's family. On Thanksgiving Day of 2002, almost a year after Dustin's death, his father walked through the cemetery where his son was buried. It was a cold and gray day, and Dustin's dad walked past bare trees and felt dead grass crunch beneath his feet. Then he passed a row of headstones and finally arrived at his son's grave. He sat down on the cold ground next to Dustin's headstone and he put one hand on it. Then he took a breath, reached into his pocket with the other hand, pulled out a revolver, pressed the barrel against his chest, and fired. Dustin's father died on his son's grave, and he left behind a note saying he had cried every day since his son's death. And not long after Dustin's father took his own life, people in town started to wonder if Tracy and Michael had pushed things too far, by going on a national TV talk show and had driven Dustin's father to take his own life. And when the town of Early, Iowa started to turn against Tracy and Michael started fighting all the time. And the fighting got even worse in the summer of 2003 when it became clear that investigators had all but given up on finding the second attacker, and the case seemed like it was going to go cold. And so, not long after that, Michael and Tracy got divorced, and Tracy left Early, Iowa with her kids, hoping she could put everything that had happened behind her. With Tracy gone, Deputy Brusher knew the case was no longer a priority, and that even if it remained open, the case files would likely just sit in a drawer somewhere collecting dust. And for years, Brusher would be right. Fast forward to the end of 2008, 7 years after Dustin's death. Detective Trent Valletta of Iowa's Division of Criminal Investigation was sitting at his desk looking at crime scene photos of Dustin Wade lying dead in Tracy's bedroom. Part of Valletta's job was to review cold cases. Cold cases are those that remain open but likely cannot move forward without the discovery of new evidence. And the cold case involving Dustin and Tracy, which hadn't progressed in years, occupied most of Valletta's time and energy. Because when he reviewed the files, there were several things he just could not shake. He didn't understand why there was absolutely no information about the supposed puppet master behind Dustin and this other phantom second attacker, or why Michael had seemingly been dropped as a suspect without any definitive proof that he really wasn't involved. And the more Valletta studied the crime scene photos, autopsy report, interviews, and the pink spiral notebook found in Dustin's car, the more he felt like evidence had been overlooked and that the case really needed to be closely re-examined. But Valletta knew he would need to have something far more concrete than just his feelings about the case to get the resources and manpower needed to remount a full investigation. And so, in early 2009, a couple of months after Valletta had begun looking back into this case, Valletta reached out to an Iowa State Police detective who he trusted. The guy was a former Navy SEAL, an expert marksman, and was known for catching things at crime scenes that others might miss. And when this detective dug into the case files to help Valletta, something jumped out to him right away. And what he saw would give Valletta enough new information to convince his bosses to fully reopen and reinvestigate this case. And once they did that, Valletta was able to find the so-called puppet master who had planned everything on the night that Dustin Wade showed up at Tracy Roberts' house. Based on new information discovered after Valletta and the other detectives started reviewing the case, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe actually happened on the night Dustin Wade died, December 13th, 2001. On the evening of December 13th, Dustin pulled his white sedan into the driveway of a home in a suburban neighborhood. He stepped out of the car, walked up to the front door, and knocked. A moment later, he heard the sound of the puppet master calling for him to come inside. And so Dustin opened the door, stepped inside, and he was immediately greeted by the puppet master who was smiling at him. Before Dustin could say anything, the puppet master asked Dustin if he wouldn't mind writing a few things down for them. Dustin said no problem, and he followed the puppet master into the kitchen and sat down at the table. And as soon as he was seated, the puppet master handed him a pink notebook along with a pen and told him to write down everything they said. And so Dustin just did as he was told. He wrote down everything the puppet master said. And when Dustin was finished, he asked the puppet master if there was any other work they needed from him. And the puppet master said yes, actually there was something they wanted to show him that was in the upstairs bedroom. And so the puppet master got up and told Dustin to follow them, and Dustin did just that. Once they got upstairs, the puppet master led Dustin into a bedroom, and while Dustin was standing near the door of the bedroom, the puppet master walked around the bed and crouched down out of Dustin's view for a second. And so Dustin just stood there waiting to see whatever it was the puppet master wanted to show him. Then suddenly, the puppet master stood up, turned around, and pointed 2 guns directly at Dustin. And before Dustin could figure out what was happening, the puppet master fired multiple shots at him. One of the bullets hit Dustin in the stomach and he began to stumble backwards, and then when he turned to run out into the hallway, the puppet master shot him again in the arm. Dustin cried out for help, but the puppet master kept on shooting and put another round into his back, which caused Dustin to fall to the ground onto his chest. At this point, Dustin was barely breathing and a huge pool of blood was forming all around his body. The puppet master, who by this point had stopped shooting, took a few steps forward and stood directly over Dustin. They aimed one of their guns at the back of his head and fired 4 more shots, killing Dustin. Then, the puppet master put the guns down, ran out of the bedroom, flew down the stairs, and rushed to the kitchen. They picked up the pink spiral notebook they had given Dustin to write in and ran to the front of the house. They threw the front door open, stepped out into the cold winter air, and walked over to the driveway where Dustin's car was parked. They opened the unlocked driver's side door, reached across, and placed the pink notebook on the seat. Then the puppet master calmly walked back inside, headed upstairs to the bedroom, and yelled for their children to get help. It would turn out there had never been a home invasion or an attack on Tracy Roberts by Dustin and some unknown second attacker. In truth, the puppet master was Tracy, and she had killed Dustin in cold blood, and almost everything she had told the police was a lie. Tracy had set up the entire thing. She knew Dustin would be easy to manipulate, and so on the promise of giving him some extra work for some money he could use to buy more video games, she had lured Dustin to her house and then tricked him into writing a fake confession in that pink notebook. Then she murdered Dustin and then wrapped pantyhose around her own neck to give herself an injury, and then she tried to frame her ex-husband for hiring Dustin to kill her so she could win the custody battle for her son. And it was the former Navy SEAL who had pointed out to Valletta that the crime scene photos didn't match with Tracy's story. She said she had been attacked in the dark and was wildly firing her gun behind her, and then also shooting at a shadow of her attacker as he tried to get up off the floor. The former Navy SEAL said that it would have been impossible for someone even with his level of expertise in firearms to create the gunshot pattern found on Dustin's body while struggling and firing blind. And he told Valletta he was certain that the multiple shots to the back of Dustin's head had been made with the light on and with the shooter standing directly over Dustin with a clear view of their target. And once Valletta had that information, he was able to convince his bosses to let him reinvestigate the case. And it turned out that when he tracked Tracy Roberts down, she was living under a new name in Ohio, she was using a British passport she'd obtained with forged documents, and she was presenting herself to some people as a London socialite, and even using a fake British accent. Once Valletta met with Tracy, her story about the home invasion unraveled quickly. Valletta discovered discrepancies in different interviews she'd given to the police, to the newspapers, and on the Montel Williams show. And eventually, her second ex-husband, Michael, admitted that he had never fully believed Tracy's version of events, and that was probably why it seemed like he was lying during his polygraph test. And with Michael and others who had been close to Tracy now helping police, they were able to get enough evidence to finally arrest Tracy for Dustin's murder. Tracy would be convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are only available on YouTube. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.